She was one of the most powerful women in New York City, and she had no idea the man sitting 3 feet in front of her, hands on the wheel, eyes on the mirror, was the only thing standing between her and the people who wanted to destroy everything she had built. She called him just the driver. He let her. Because Mason Reed had spent 15 years learning that the most dangerous men in any room are always the ones nobody looks at twice. And somebody with money, patience, and a very long memory, had placed him right beside her on purpose. If this story already has you leaning forward, you are exactly where you belong. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. Because we release stories like this every single week, and trust me, you do not want to walk into the middle of one. Stay with me until the very last word tonight, because this story builds into something you won't see coming. And before we go any further, drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The black Mercedes pulled out of the Caldwell Industries parking garage at exactly 7:14 in the morning, the same way it did every weekday, give or take 3 minutes depending on whether Avery had taken a call before leaving her office. Mason Reed noticed the 3 minutes. He noticed most things. He'd been driving Avery Caldwell for 11 days. In that time, she had spoken to him directly on 4 occasions. 3 of those times were to tell him she was running late. Once was to ask him to turn the heat down 2 degrees. She had not asked his name. He knew this because he'd been waiting, in a low-key way, to see how long it would take. Some principles, that was the word he still used in his head, from the old life principle, the person you protect. Some of them came around after a week. Some took a month. Some never bothered at all. Avery Caldwell, 30 years old, net worth somewhere north of $1.2 billion depending on the quarter, looked like she was firmly in the never bothering at all category. That was fine. Mason wasn't here to be liked. He adjusted the mirror by a fraction, not to see her better, but to see the street behind them better, and caught the gray SUV again. It had been 3 cars back since they left the garage. Now it was 2. "We're going to take Madison instead of 5th this morning," Mason said. In the back seat, Avery didn't look up from her phone. "5th is faster. There's construction starting at 53rd. It'll back up." There was no construction at 53rd. He checked that morning, but he needed to change the route without explaining why, and a traffic lie was cleaner than the truth right now. "Fine," she said, already back to typing. He turned on to Madison. The gray SUV turned with them.
Odyssey.
Avery Caldwell had not always been the kind of woman who looked through people. Her father had raised her differently. Daniel Caldwell, a man who remembered every employee's birthday and kept a folded list of their kids' names in his wallet, just because he thought it mattered. He ran a decent-sized textile company out of New Jersey, nothing glamorous, but he'd built it with his hands and his word, and people who worked for him tended to stay. Then his business partner of 11 years forged loan documents, redirected company accounts, and vanished to somewhere without an extradition treaty. The company folded in 4 months. Daniel Caldwell never fully recovered. He died of a heart attack 3 years later, 61 years old, in a hospital room that Avery had paid for because by then she'd already started rebuilding. Not his company, but something harder and colder and entirely her own. She was 23 when she started Caldwell Industries. She was 30 when it crossed $1 billion. In between, she had learned one very specific lesson, and she had learned it so thoroughly that it lived in her body now, in the way she held her shoulders and the way she never quite let a smile reach her eyes. The people who seem the most trustworthy are the most dangerous ones, which was why she had 3 separate legal teams that didn't know about each other, a personal security consultant who swept her office for devices every other Tuesday, and a strict rule by no personal conversations with staff. Not because she was cruel, because she couldn't afford to be wrong again. Mason pulled into the underground lot beneath her midtown office building and watched the gray SUV roll past the entrance without stopping. He sat for a moment after Avery climbed out, watching the ramp in the mirror. "Mr. Reed," she said, already halfway to the elevator. She hadn't turned around. 7 o'clock pickup tomorrow. I have a breakfast in the financial district." "Understood." She was gone. Mason pulled out a small notebook, actual paper, not his phone, and wrote down the SUV's partial plate. He'd only caught the first 4 digits. New York plates. But the vehicle itself had that particular rental fleet quality, slightly too clean, slightly too generic. He sat in the empty parking level and thought about it for a moment. Then he wrote down something else: the time, the route, and the words, third day in a row. He picked up Emma from St. Catherine's Elementary at 3:15. She was 7, and she ran the way 7-year-olds run. Like forward momentum is the only thing keeping the whole operation together. She hit the passenger door with both hands before Mason had fully stopped, which meant he'd have to have the same conversation again. "What's the rule?" he said after she'd climbed in and buckled herself. "Don't run at moving cars." Because? Because you might trip and then the car doesn't stop fast enough even if the driver wants to. She said it with the particular flatness of a child who has memorized something purely to end the conversation. "Can we get Thai food?" "We have leftovers." "The leftovers are sad." "Leftovers can't be sad, Em. They don't have feelings." "The rice is definitely sad. It's all dry." He pulled out of the school pickup lane, already checking the mirrors out of habit. Nothing unusual. A school zone in Queens on a Tuesday afternoon, nothing but minivans and a crossing guard who waved at everyone with the same level of enthusiasm regardless of whether they waved back. "How was school?" he asked. "We did fractions. I don't really get why we need them. Because if you want to split a pizza fairly, you need to know how much a quarter is." She thought about this. What if you just cut it and whoever complains gets less? That's not math, that's negotiation. Maybe I'll do negotiation instead. You need math for negotiation too, unfortunately. She accepted this with a small, dissatisfied sound and looked out the window. Mason drove. He thought about the gray SUV. He thought about the parking garage and the way one of the security cameras on the B2 level had been at a slightly different angle than it was on his first day. Subtle enough that most people wouldn't register it, but he'd spent a long time in his life noticing things that were almost the same as before. Almost was the dangerous part. He hadn't said anything to Avery yet. He had 11 days of data and a gut feeling, and in his experience, billionaires didn't respond well to gut feelings delivered by their drivers. He needed something more concrete. The breakthrough came on a Thursday. He'd arrived 20 minutes early to the garage, he always did, and he was doing his usual walk of the vehicle and the immediate area when he noticed the security badge clipped to a support column near the elevator. Not dropped. Placed. The clip was fastened around a horizontal pipe, carefully, like someone had taken a second to make sure it wouldn't fall. It was a Caldwell Industries badge, Access Level 3, which got you into most of the building's non-executive floors. The photo on it was of a man he didn't recognize, the mid-40s, wide face, name listed as T. Greer. Mason photographed it without touching it, then went back to his car. He ran the name through 3 different channels that evening, after Emma was asleep, using a laptop he kept in a fireproof box under his bed. 2 of those channels were things he wasn't supposed to still have access to, technically, but technical was a flexible word when your daughter's safety was involved. T. Greer didn't come back as anything interesting. Medium-level facilities contractor, worked for a company that had serviced 3 or 4 midtown office buildings in the past decade, but the badge's access level was wrong. Level 3 didn't get you into parking garages. That was level 1 or 2. And yet that badge had been in the garage. Someone had modified it, or someone wanted it found. He sat with that for a long time. Well, Friday morning, he picked Avery up at 7 sharp, and they were 4 blocks from the building when he decided to say something. "Ms. Caldwell." "I'm on a call in 8 minutes," she said without looking up. "I understand. This is quick." Something in his voice must have been different, because she looked up. Mason kept his eyes on the traffic ahead. "I want to ask you about your parking garage security. Specifically, who has current access to the B2 level and whether all the cameras on that level have been recently serviced." A pause. "Why?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Because one of the cameras has been repositioned in the past week, and I found a level 3 badge in that garage yesterday morning that had been modified to allow access it shouldn't have." Another pause. Longer. "You're my driver," she said. "Yes." "You're not my security team." "No." "So why?" "Because I use that garage twice a day, and I noticed something that doesn't add up, and I thought you should know." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. "You can do whatever you want with it. I just wanted to tell you." Avery looked at him. He could see it in his peripheral vision, that particular quality of attention, sharp, measuring, not entirely hostile, but not warm either. the look of someone who was deciding whether to file something under useful or problem. "I'll mention it to my security director," she said finally. "Okay. Don't mention it to anyone else." "I wasn't planning to." She went back to her phone. He drove the rest of the way in silence. But she had listened. And something in the way she'd said, "I'll mention it," precise, immediate, no sighing or dismissal, told him that she'd actually do it within the hour. Maybe she wasn't entirely what he'd thought she was. He got the call on a Sunday night, 10:53 p.m., while he was washing dishes and Emma had been asleep for 2 hours. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Then he did, because in his experience, unknown numbers at 10:53 were rarely people trying to sell him something. "Mason Reed," the voice said. Not a question, a statement. The kind you make when you want the other person to understand you already know exactly who you're talking to. Mason turned off the faucet. He didn't say anything. "Still doing the strong silent type, I see," the voice said. Male, probably mid-40s, accent that placed him somewhere in the mid-Atlantic region, but had been softened deliberately, the way people soften accents when they've spent a lot of time trying to sound neutral. "That's fine. I'll talk. You listen." Mason leaned against the counter and looked out the kitchen window at the dark street below. "Your daughter goes to St. Catherine's Elementary. She gets out at 3:15. On Tuesdays, she stays an extra 30 minutes for art club. She's working on a papier-mâché project right now, something about animals. She carries a blue backpack, North Face, small size, has a little keychain on it that looks like a yellow star." A pause. "She waved at the crossing guard last Tuesday. Nice kid." Mason's hand tightened on the phone. He didn't speak. He wouldn't give the satisfaction, but his heart rate had done something specific in those 30 seconds. Not spiked exactly, more like settled into a different gear, the gear he recognized from the old days, the one that was very calm on the outside and doing a great deal of very fast work on the inside. "Here's what we need," the voice continued. "Next Tuesday evening, Ms. Caldwell is attending the Meridian Foundation Gala bus. You're scheduled to pick her up at 10:30 from the plaza. We need you to not be there. Cancel, have a family emergency, whatever story works for you. She takes a cab or another car service. She walks into that event unprotected." Another pause. "That's it. That's all we're asking." "Who are you?" Mason said. "Doesn't matter who I am. Matters that I know where your daughter goes to school. If you touch her, nobody's touching anybody," the voice said, with a particular kind of smoothness that was somehow worse than aggression. "We're asking for one night, one simple thing. You've been a driver for 11 days. This isn't your fight, Mr. Reed. Walk away from it and go back to your quiet life." The line went dead. Mason stood in his kitchen for a moment. Then he very carefully set the phone down on the counter, went to Emma's room, stood in the doorway, and watched her sleep. She was on her side the way she always slept, one arm draped over a stuffed elephant that had lost most of its trunk stuffing and been repaired twice with mismatched thread. He watched her breathe. Then he went back to the kitchen, opened the box under his bed, and started making a different kind of call. There are things Mason Reed had never told anyone about his time after the SEALs. He'd told Emma he'd worked in security for a while, which was technically true. He'd told the woman at the school registration desk that he was self-employed, which was also technically true. What he'd never told anyone, not here, not in this life, was that for 3 years after he left the Navy, he'd worked for a private outfit called Meridian Tactical Group. Not the Gala Foundation. Different Meridian, different world. MTG operated in the gray zones that governments needed but couldn't officially acknowledge. Asset recovery, target surveillance, a few things that didn't have clean names. Mason had been good at it. The problem was that 4 of the men he'd worked with had become too good at it, in a specific way. They'd started doing private jobs on the side. Not gray zone. Black. The kind of work that ended with people in the ground who hadn't agreed to be there. When Mason realized what was happening, he'd done the one thing that nobody in that world expected. He talked to a federal prosecutor. The case took 14 months. 2 men went to prison. 1 disappeared and was presumed dead. 1 cooperated with the government and got a reduced deal, and Mason had always suspected that particular decision would come back to cause problems eventually. After his testimony, the marshals gave him a new name, a new city, a new start. He was supposed to be invisible, but the caller tonight knew his name. His real name, and they knew about Emma. So either his cover had been compromised, which meant he needed to contact his handler immediately, or something else was happening, something that scared him more. They'd found him through Avery. He pulled up the employment records he'd been given for the Caldwell Industries driving position. Agency paperwork, background check, all of it. He'd looked at it before, but quickly. He looked at it again now, slowly, going through every page. And there it was. Buried in the agency's contractor form, in the field labeled referral source. Internal, R. Vale, board. Mason sat back. He hadn't applied for this job. He'd been placed. Richard Vale, Avery's mentor, her trusted board partner, the man she described in the one profile he'd found on her as the person who believed in me when no one else did, had specifically requested that Mason Reed be assigned as her driver. Except Mason Reed's identity was supposed to be buried so deep that a casual board member shouldn't have been able to find it, which meant Richard Vale was not a casual board member. Mason closed the laptop and thought about that for a long time. Outside, the city made its usual nighttime sounds. A cab somewhere, a siren 3 blocks over, the low ambient hum of 10 million people existing in a very small space. He thought about Avery in the back of the car, barely looking up, about the way she'd listened, actually listened, when he'd mentioned the garage. He thought about the caller's voice. "This isn't your fight, Mr. Reed." The thing was, and this was the part that had always been true about Mason, the part that had gotten him into federal court at 30 and into a driver's seat at 32. Mason Reed had a genuinely difficult time watching people get set up and doing nothing about it. It wasn't heroics. It wasn't some need to be the one who saves the day. It was just that he'd been a person who testified when he could have stayed quiet, and he'd understood since then that staying quiet was always a choice, and that choice had weight. He had a daughter with a yellow star keychain and a papier-mâché animal project and a strong opinion about leftover rice. And he had an employer, barely, technically, who didn't know that her entire board might be compromised, that her driver was a protected federal witness, and that someone had put the two of them together deliberately. He owed her that information. He wasn't sure she was going to take it well. He called her at 7 the next morning, on the direct line that was listed in his employment paperwork. It rang 4 times before she answered. "It's Monday," she said. "I don't need pickup until—" "I know, I'm not calling about pickup." He paused. "I need to meet with you. In person, not the car. Somewhere your building security isn't involved." A long silence. "Mr. Reed, someone called me last night. They know where my daughter goes to school. They know her schedule, what she carries in her backpack, what project she's working on in art class." He kept his voice level. "They told me not to be at the plaza next Tuesday when you leave the gala." Another silence. Different quality this time. "Who called you?" "I don't know yet, but I found something in my employment paperwork that I need to show you, and I think there may be someone close to you who is not what they seem." He could hear her breathing, carefully, controlled. The breathing of someone who had spent a long time making sure nothing showed on her face. "Where?" she said finally. "Somewhere public. A coffee shop, a diner, somewhere with windows and multiple exits." "You're being careful," he said. "I'm being careful. I think you should be too." Another pause, then, "There's a place called Whitmore's Diner on Lex and 61st. I'll be there in 45 minutes. "I'll be there in 30, he said. "I want to check the room first." She didn't argue with that, which told him something about Avery Caldwell. She recognized operational thinking when she heard it, even if she didn't fully understand where it was coming from yet. He grabbed his jacket. He grabbed the notebook with the partial plate numbers and the photograph of the modified badge. Then he stopped and texted his neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, and asked if Emma could ride the school bus that morning, explaining that he had an early work appointment. Mrs. Okafor, who was 63 and had a soft spot for Emma, that she expressed primarily through leaving cookies outside their door, texted back a thumbs up within 30 seconds. He stood in the hallway of his apartment and looked at Emma's closed door. Then he went to meet the most powerful woman in New York City and tell her that everything she thought she knew about the people around her might be wrong. He'd had harder conversations. Not many, but a few. Whitmore's Diner was the kind of place that had been there long enough that the booths had been reupholstered twice, and the coffee was good in the basic, unpretentious way that just meant they used decent beans and didn't mess with it. Mason got there 32 minutes early, sat in the back corner booth with a sight line to both the front door and the kitchen exit, ordered black coffee, and waited. Avery arrived 6 minutes before they'd agreed on, which he noticed and filed away. She was in different clothes than her usual office armor. Dark jeans, a coat that was expensive but not obviously so, hair down. She scanned the room when she came in, found him in the corner, walked over without hesitating, slid into the seat across from him. Up close, without the formality of the car and the partition of roles, employer, driver, she looked younger than 30, in the specific way that people look younger when they're tired and not performing anything. She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug the server placed in front of her before it was fully on the table. "Tell me," she said. So he did. He told her about the camera, about the badge, about the call, all of it, every detail, including Emma's yellow star keychain, because she needed to understand the level of information these people had. She listened without interrupting. He'd expected questions, pushback, some form of the "you're just a driver" energy from the car. But she sat still and listened the way someone listens when they're integrating information fast and don't want to break the flow. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The referral source," she said. "In your paperwork." "Say the name." "Richard Vale." Her face did something small and controlled and painful. "I need to tell you something else," Mason said. She looked at him. He'd rehearsed this, thought about how to say it in the car, in the 32 minutes he'd sat in the diner corner. He still wasn't sure there was a clean way. "I didn't find your employment listing on a job board," he said. "My paperwork says I came through the agency, but I never applied. I've been trying to reconstruct how I got here, and the trail leads back to that referral. Someone placed me in this job deliberately." He paused. "I don't think it was meant to help you." Avery set down her coffee cup. She looked out the window at Lexington Avenue, at the Monday morning foot traffic, at people walking past carrying their lives in bags and briefcases. "What are you?" she said quietly. Not unkindly, just directly. The question of someone who needed the actual answer. Mason looked at his coffee. "I was a Navy SEAL," he said. "After that I did private security work that I can't fully describe. Some of what I did, some of what people I worked with did, crossed lines. I testified about it. After that I wasn't Mason Reed anymore. Officially." He paused. "Until apparently I was again." Avery looked at him for a long moment. "You're a protected witness," she said. "I was. I think my cover may have been compromised. I think whoever is behind this found me specifically because of my background, because they wanted someone with my skills in a position close to you, either to use me or to set me up." She absorbed that. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "If you're trying to protect yourself and your daughter, the smart move is to do what they said. Cancel Tuesday. Walk away." "Yes," he agreed. "So why?" "Because someone is setting you up," he said simply. "And I've done the stay quiet thing before, and it doesn't sit well with me." He looked at her directly. "Also, I'm fairly sure that walking away doesn't make Emma safe. People who know what she carries in her backpack don't let go of that leverage because you did what they asked one time." Avery looked at him for a long time. Outside, a bus went past. A delivery guy on a bike weaved between a cab and a sedan and somehow made it look reasonable. "Okay," Avery Caldwell said. "Okay? Okay, I believe you." She straightened. "And okay, what do we do next?" Mason almost said something about how he was an interesting choice of pronoun given that she'd told him 11 days ago he was just her driver. He didn't say it, because she was looking at him like someone who had spent a long time standing alone in the middle of a fight and had just, for the first time in a very long while, decided to stand next to someone else. And that, Mason thought, was the part that mattered. He opened his notebook to a fresh page and slid it across the table. "Start here," he said. "Tell me everything you know about Richard Vale. Everything. Not what he's told you, what you've actually observed." She picked up the pen, and they started. The notebook page filled up faster than Mason expected. Avery wrote the way she apparently did everything, efficiently, without wasted motion, with the particular intensity of someone who had trained herself not to let her hands slow down when her mind was moving fast. She didn't editorialize. She didn't explain why she was including something or apologize for including things that seemed small. She just wrote what she had observed in order and let it sit there. Mason read as she wrote, occasionally asking her to slow down, occasionally circling something and drawing a line to a question mark. They were at Whitmore's diner for 2 hours and 14 minutes. Mason knew because he was tracking time the way he always tracked it in situations where he wasn't fully in control of variables, constantly, automatically, in the background of everything else. By the time she set the pen down, they had 4 pages. Richard Vail, 62 years old, had entered Avery's life 8 years ago through what she'd always understood to be a chance introduction at a Columbia Business Symposium. He'd approached her after she gave a panel presentation. She'd been 22, barely 6 months into building what would become Caldwell Industries, operating out of a rented desk in a shared office space in Soho. He'd told her he admired her thinking. He'd offered to have coffee. The coffee became a mentorship. The mentorship became a board seat 4 years later when Caldwell Industries was large enough to need one. The board seat became an executive partnership that Avery described as, and she paused here before writing this, which Mason noticed, the foundation I built everything else on. When did you last audit his access levels? Mason asked. I don't personally audit access levels. That's handled by... She stopped. Her jaw tightened slightly. My security director, Cliff Harmon. Who has been in that role how long? 3 years? Who recommended him? She looked at Mason across the table. She already knew the answer. She'd known it half a second after he asked the question. He could see it happening on her face. Not surprise exactly, more like the specific expression of someone watching a thing they suspected become a thing they knew. Richard recommended him, she said. Mason didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Avery looked out the window. She had her hands flat on the table, both of them, and she pressed her fingertips against the surface like she was steadying herself without wanting it to show. I need to ask you something, she said, still looking at the street. Okay. The man on the phone. He said to leave me unprotected at the gala. Not to hurt you, not to expose you, just to leave me without coverage on a specific night. She turned back to him. What happens at the gala that would require me to be unprotected? I don't know yet, but the Meridian Foundation event is attended by a significant portion of the city's financial and media establishment. Whatever is planned, it's not private. It's meant to happen in front of people. She processed that. A setup. Most likely, something designed to look like your choice, your behavior, your failure. Not an attack. That would generate sympathy. Something that damages your credibility. The board vote, she said. Her voice was flat. There's an emergency board vote in 3 weeks. Richard proposed it 2 months ago, a structural review of executive decision-making authority. I thought it was standard governance protocol. She exhaled slowly through her nose. It is not standard governance protocol. No, Mason agreed. It probably isn't. They sat with that for a moment. A table over, 2 older men were having a loud, cheerful disagreement about the Yankees, and the server was refilling their coffee and telling them both they were wrong. The diner smelled like bacon grease and dish soap, and something sweet from a pie rotating under glass on the counter. I have to be careful how I handle this, Avery said. If I confront Richard directly and I'm wrong, or if I'm right but I don't have hard evidence, he'll know I'm onto him and whatever he's planning accelerates. If I go to my security director and he's compromised, same problem. She looked at Mason. I need to gather evidence without anyone inside knowing I'm doing it. Yes. Which means I need someone outside the existing structure. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. I don't actually know anything about you, she said. I mean, I know what you just told me, but I don't have any way to verify it. That's fair. For all I know, you're part of it, a more elaborate version. Also fair, he said. I'd be thinking the same thing in your position. She looked at him steadily. He looked back at her, and he didn't try to fill the silence with reassurance, because reassurance from someone you just met is worth approximately nothing, and she was smart enough to know that. The phone call, she said finally. They told you to leave me unprotected. If you were part of it, you wouldn't be here telling me about the call. You'd just not show up on Tuesday. That's the logic, yes. It's not airtight. No, he agreed. It's not. Another pause. Why did they put you here? She said. If you're the person you say you are, a former SEAL, someone with that kind of background, why place you as my driver specifically? What were they expecting you to do? It was the question Mason had been turning over since 10:53 the night before, and the answer he kept coming back to wasn't comfortable. I think they expected me to be controllable, he said slowly. A man with a daughter who can be threatened, with a buried identity that can be exposed, with a past that makes him look dangerous if someone decides to frame it that way. I think they put me here because they thought they owned me before I knew they existed. He paused. And then they plan to use me as the story. Not just leave you unprotected at the gala. Use my presence, my background, to make whatever happened look connected to something reckless or corrupt on your part. Your mysterious, unvetted driver. Your secret muscle with a dark history. Avery was very still. They weren't going to hurt me at the gala, she said quietly. I don't think so. They were going to use you to hurt me, after. That's my working theory. She picked up her coffee, realized it was cold, set it down. Okay, she said, for the second time that morning. Here's what we're going to do. Mason waited. You continue as my driver. Nothing changes outwardly. I don't alter my behavior toward Richard. I don't change my schedule. I don't do anything that signals I know something is wrong. She had shifted into a different register now, still quiet, but with an efficiency to it, the way she must sound running a board meeting. Meanwhile, you use whatever channels you have, and I don't need the details of what those channels are, to find out who that caller was, and what the connection is between Richard and your previous life. I'll start pulling financial records internally, things I have legitimate access to, and I'll do it through my personal attorney, not through anyone in the building. She paused. Can you get your daughter somewhere safe without it looking deliberate? He'd already thought about that. Mrs. Okafor's granddaughter was getting married in Philadelphia next weekend. She'd mentioned it 3 times in the last month. He'd been thinking about asking if Emma could go along, spend a few days, treat it as a fun trip. Yes, he said. Do that this week, before Tuesday. Agreed. She reached across the table and picked up the pen again and tore a page from the notebook. His notebook, which under other circumstances might have bothered him, but right now seemed like the least relevant thing possible, and wrote a phone number on it. This is a number that goes to a device that isn't connected to anything registered to me or to Caldwell Industries. I bought it myself, cash, from a store in Newark, 3 months ago, when the board vote was first proposed and I started feeling uneasy about things I couldn't name. She slid it across to him. I had the same instinct you had. I just didn't have the information to know what to do with it. Mason looked at the number on the paper. Then he looked at her. He'd spent most of the past 11 days thinking of Avery Caldwell as a certain kind of person, closed off, isolated by her own success, looking through the people around her because she'd learned that looking at them too closely was dangerous. And that was still true, probably. But it wasn't the whole thing. The burner phone in Newark. The way she'd listened this morning. The way she was already building a plan in real time, adjusting, prioritizing, not wasting energy on the emotional components when there was work to be done. She'd been worried about something for 3 months, and she'd handled it the way she apparently handled most things, alone, quietly, with one hand already on a contingency. I'll call you tonight, he said. She nodded, put her coat on, and stood. Then she stopped and looked at him with an expression that had something uncertain in it, something she didn't quite know what to do with. Your daughter, she said. Emma. Yes. Is she okay? Right now this morning. Is she okay? He thought about Emma on the school bus, probably arguing with the kid across the aisle about something, probably winning. She's fine. She doesn't know anything is wrong. Good, Avery said. And she meant it. Not as a formality, not as the polite thing to say. She just meant it. She left the diner. Mason sat with his cold coffee and his 4 pages of notes and thought about what came next. It wasn't a comfortable set of thoughts, but it was workable. He could work with workable. The thing about living under a protected identity is that it makes you very good at one particular skill, understanding how information moves. Not the content of information, that was secondary, but the way it traveled, who touched it, how many hands it passed through before it reached whoever wanted it. Mason had spent 3 years essentially invisible, and being invisible required understanding visibility, who was looking, where they were looking from, what would cause them to look harder. He spent Monday night, after Emma was asleep, mapping what he knew. He used the paper notebook because digital traces were patient in a way paper wasn't. They sat there waiting to be found, even after you thought you'd deleted them. He drew a rough grid and started filling in names and connections and the questions that lived in the gaps between them. Richard Vale. Cliff Harmon, the security director. T. Greer, the name on the modified badge. The modified badge itself, which gave access to a parking level it shouldn't have accessed. The gray SUV, partial plate. The caller, unknown. The referral source in Mason's employment paperwork that traced back to Richard. And then the thread that connected it to Mason's previous life, because someone had known his real name. Known it well enough and securely enough that they'd used it in a referral document without hesitation, which meant they weren't guessing and they weren't fishing. They knew, which narrowed the pool considerably. The federal case that had reorganized Mason's life had involved 7 men, including himself. 2 were in prison. 1 was presumed dead. 1 had cooperated with the government, a man named Darren Cole, who'd taken a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony that corroborated and expanded on what Mason had already provided. Cole had been released 14 months ago after serving 4 of a possible 12 years. Mason had always thought the reduced deal was too generous. He'd said so at the time to the prosecutor, who had explained with the patient exhaustion of someone who'd had this conversation many times that they needed Cole's specific knowledge of financial routing to make the broader case stick. He wrote Cole's name in the grid. Then he wrote Richard Vale's name again in a different place and drew a line between them with a question mark over it. The Meridian Foundation. Different from Meridian Tactical Group. Completely different organization, charitable, focused on urban development initiatives, the kind of foundation that got its name on museum wings and hospital floors. But the name sitting in the same case file as his old unit's name had always struck him as coincidence of the unusual kind. He found the foundation's board of directors through public records that were a Google search away for anyone who wanted to look. 7 members. He went through them methodically, cross-referencing against anything he knew. 3rd name. Senior attorney, listed as legal counsel to the foundation's board for the past 6 years. Martin Sykes. Mason knew that name. Martin Sykes had represented Darren Cole during plea negotiations. He'd been Cole's attorney. Mason stared at that for a long moment. He wrote a line from Sykes to Cole, a line from Sykes to the Meridian Foundation, and then very carefully, because he wasn't certain yet, and certainty mattered, a dotted line from the Meridian Foundation to Richard Vale. If Vale was on the Foundation's donor list, and men like Vale were always on donor lists, and if Sykes had been managing the legal connection point between Cole's world and Vale's world, he stopped himself. It was building a structure out of coincidence and inference, and he needed actual evidence before he trusted any of it. But the shape of it was there. The shape was ugly and it was familiar, in the way that corruption had a recognizable shape once you'd spent enough time looking at it. The same basic structure repeating itself. Money laundering through legitimacy, power protecting power through carefully maintained legal distances. He closed the notebook. He called the burner number Avery had given him. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting. "I have a name," he said, "Martin Sykes. He's listed as legal counsel to the Meridian Foundation Board. He was also the attorney who represented a man named Darren Cole during federal plea negotiations in a case I was central to." He paused. "Cole is the most likely person who knew my real identity and could have provided it to someone with money and motive." A silence on Avery's end. He could hear her moving, footsteps, a door closing, like she was finding a more private space within whatever room she'd been in. "Sykes," she said. "I know that name." Mason waited. "He's been recommended to me twice as outside legal counsel for some of the board's more complex transactions. I declined both times. I use Harrison and Lowe. I've used them for years. I didn't see the need to bring in someone new." Her voice was careful. "Richard recommended him, both times." Another line in the grid, Mason thought. Another dotted line becoming solid. "I need to know Cole's connection to Vale directly," he said. "Whether there's a financial relationship, shared interests, anything that puts them in the same room before this. That's going to require access to things I don't have. Tell me what you need, and I'll tell you if I can get it." Corporate donor records for the Meridian Foundation, specifically donors who came on board in the 18 months after Cole's release. And Vale's personal financial disclosure, the version he filed with your board when he took his seat. It would have listed major interests and affiliations. "I have access to the disclosure. It's in the board records." She paused. "The foundation donor records are public-facing only up to a threshold. Anything above that is private." "Do you have anyone you trust? Completely? Not someone connected to the building? who could access that through a journalistic inquiry or a legal records request without triggering anything. A pause. My personal attorney, Helena Park. She's been my attorney since I was 24. She's not connected to the board, she's not connected to Richard, and she actively dislikes Richard, which at the time I thought was a personality conflict. A beat. I suspect she saw something I didn't. Can you reach her without going through your office systems? She and I have lunch every other Thursday. This week's Thursday is hers. I'll move it to tomorrow. Say it's personal. Tell her as little as possible until you know what she can find. I've been telling people as little as possible since I was 23, Avery said, with a dry edge that wasn't quite humor but wasn't quite not. I have some experience with that. One more thing, Mason said. Tuesday night, the gala. I'm still attending. I know, I'll be there. We don't change anything visible. He paused. But I want to have someone on the exterior of the building that I trust. Someone who isn't connected to your security team. Do you have someone like that? He thought about it. He had one person, maybe. A former SEAL he'd stayed loosely in contact with. Loosely meaning a text every 3 or 4 months. The kind of contact that kept a thread alive without pulling on it. A man named Garrett, who now ran a legitimate maritime security operation out of Baltimore and had the particular quality of not asking unnecessary questions. Possibly, Mason said. I need to make a call. Make it, she paused. Mason. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He noted it the way he noted everything, quietly, without making it mean too much. Yes, he said. Thank you for not doing what they asked. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said the thing that was actually true. They were going to use Emma either way. Doing what they asked just removes my ability to do anything about it. I know, she said, but still. He talked to Garrett the next morning, standing on his building's roof, which was the closest thing to signal secure he could get without equipment he no longer officially had. Garrett answered on the first ring, which for Garrett meant he'd been awake for at least 2 hours already, because Garrett did not answer promptly if there was any chance he could still be sleeping. Reed, Garrett said. Just the name, flat, like a door opening. I need a favor. Okay. It involves standing outside a fancy party on Tuesday night watching for people who look like they're watching for someone. A pause. Is this the kind of favor where I might need to do something about what I see? Possibly. I'd like it not to be. I'd prefer observe and report. But be ready. Another pause. Garrett was processing in the specific way that Garrett processed things. Not slow, just thorough, checking angles the way a carpenter checks square before cutting. Is this connected to your current situation? Garrett asked carefully. By current situation, he meant the protected identity, which he knew about only in the vaguest terms because Mason had thought it wise to give someone a vague outline in case he ever needed to explain his own absence to someone who knew Emma. Tangentially, Mason said. Someone found me through a job placement. I'm working with the principal to address it. The principal is the billionaire? You saw the papers. I saw the car service company's website. It's a small industry. Another pause. She dangerous? No, the people around her are. Okay. A breath. Tuesday night. Send me details. I'll drive up. Garrett, Reed, send me the details. He sent them. Emma went to Philadelphia on Friday afternoon with Mrs. Okafor and a bag that Emma had packed herself, which meant it contained 3 stuffed animals, 1 pair of clean socks, and a library book about deep-sea fish that she'd been carrying everywhere for 2 weeks. Mason had told her it was a special trip, that she'd get to see a wedding and eat fancy food and maybe see some of Philadelphia. And Emma had received this information by immediately asking whether she could also go to the aquarium, because she'd heard Philadelphia had one. And Mason had said he'd check with Mrs. Okafor, and Mrs. Okafor had said absolutely with the enthusiasm of someone who would walk across broken glass for that child. He stood on the sidewalk and watched Mrs. Okafor's sedan until it turned the corner. Then he stood there for another moment. He was aware that he was doing the thing he'd done since Emma was born, the constant low-level accounting of threats and distances, the way a certain part of his brain never fully stood down. When she was safe, the accounting became quieter. When she wasn't, it got very loud very fast. Right now it was somewhere in the middle. She was in a car heading to Philadelphia with a woman who loved her, And the people who had mentioned her school and her backpack had done so as a demonstration of capability, not a promise of action. Demonstrations were leverage. Leverage required the thing being leveraged to remain intact. He knew all of this. It helped, somewhat. He went back upstairs to his apartment, which was very quiet without Emma in it, and he sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and his cold coffee, and he thought about what Richard Vail actually wanted. Not the surface version, board control, financial leverage, removal of Avery from the CEO position. Those were the mechanisms. Mechanisms served something underneath. Avery had described Richard as the man who believed in her when no one else did. She'd built part of her identity on that relationship. The mentor who'd seen something worth developing, the steady presence in years when the company was still fragile, the person she'd allowed into the emotional architecture of her professional life in a way she'd allowed almost no one else. If Vail had known from the beginning that his interest in Avery was about access and eventual control, Mason thought about Avery's father, the textile company, the partner who vanished, the folded business, the 61-year-old man dying in a hospital room. And a question occurred to him that he hadn't thought to ask at the diner. Who had profited when Daniel Caldwell's company went under? Someone always profited. That was one of the things Mason had learned in his years of watching how money moved through the world's dark corridors. When a business failed catastrophically, especially from internal fraud, the assets went somewhere. The building, the machinery, the client contracts, the supplier relationships, all of it redistributed to whoever was positioned to receive it. He opened his laptop and started looking. It took him 4 hours and a level of database access he was definitely not supposed to still have, and he found it in a secondary acquisition record from 14 years ago. A holding company called Briar Street Capital had acquired the bulk of the remaining Caldwell textile assets through a bankruptcy auction. He spent another 2 hours tracing Briar Street Capital through its corporate structure, which was layered the way onions were layered, but with more lawyers. At the center of it was a private equity stake held by a personal investment vehicle registered to a name he now knew very well. Richard Vail had bought the bones of Avery's father's company for pennies after it was destroyed. And then, Mason almost pushed back from the table when he found this part. And then, 6 months after the acquisition, Richard Vail had appeared at a Columbia Business Symposium and approached a 22-year-old woman he had introduced himself to as a chance encounter. Mason sat very still for a long moment. The extent of it was breathtaking, not in an admirable way, but in the way of something that required a particular kind of patience and coldness over a very long period of time. Vail hadn't just positioned himself to take Avery's company. He had positioned himself 8 years ago, maybe longer. He had built the relationship deliberately, the mentorship, the board seat, the trust, the emotional dependence, all of it a slow and patient construction aimed at the moment when it would be useful. Avery thought Richard Vail was the one person who had believed in her. He had believed in Caldwell Industries, in what it would become, in what he could eventually take from it. She didn't know any of this yet. Mason was going to have to tell her. He was not looking forward to that conversation. He called the burner number. She answered in 2 rings again. He was starting to understand that was just how she was. The phone was in her hand. She was always working. She answered fast. "I found something," he said. "About your father's company." A silence. "Tell me," she said. And he told her all of it. Briar Street Capital, the bankruptcy auction, the acquisition, the timeline, the Columbia Symposium, 6 months later. He said it clearly and without softening the edges of it, because the edges mattered, and she deserved the actual shape of the thing rather than a smoothed-down version of it. When he finished, the silence on her end lasted longer than any silence in their conversation so far. He waited. He didn't fill it. "He was there," she said finally. Her voice was very controlled and very quiet, the specific quiet of something held firmly because the alternative was worse. "When my father died, Richard came to the hospital. He sat with me for 4 hours. He told me—" She stopped. Started again. "He told me he was sorry he couldn't have done more to save the company, that if he'd known about the fraud earlier, he might have been able to help." Mason closed his eyes briefly. "He sat there," she said. "He said those things to me." Avery. "I'm fine," she said immediately, the way people said it when they were specifically not asking to be asked again. He let it go. "The board voted in 3 weeks," he said. We have the connection to your father's company. We have Sykes connecting Cole to Vale. We have the badge and the camera. I need one more thing. I need something from inside Tuesday night. Something on record that puts Vale's intention in his own words or in footage he doesn't know exists. Another pause. When she spoke again, the controlled quiet was still there, but something else had moved underneath it, something harder, something that had been there longer than he'd known her. He wants footage of something going wrong at the gala, she said. He wants to use you as the story. Yes. Then let's give him what he wants, she said, and make sure we're the ones recording it. Mason looked at the grid of names in his notebook, the dotted lines that had become solid, the shape of something that had been built over years against one person who hadn't known to look for it. Walk me through what you're thinking, he said. She did. And as she talked, Mason started making adjustments to the plan in his head. The exits in the Meridian Foundation gala venue, the exterior positions he'd assigned to Garrett, the camera angles that would matter, the moments of the evening that would need to be accounted for. He thought about Emma looking at deep-sea fish in Philadelphia, carrying her library book, waving at strangers with the ease of someone who had not yet learned that the world sometimes required wariness. He thought about Richard Vale sitting in a hospital room and telling a grieving 22-year-old daughter that he was sorry he couldn't have done more. Tuesday night was 3 days away. They had work to do. The plan had 4 components, and Mason didn't love any of them. Not because they were bad plans, individually. Each piece made sense on its own terms. It was the combination that bothered him. The number of variables he couldn't control. The number of people whose behavior he was predicting based on incomplete information. The number of ways the whole thing could slide sideways at once and leave Avery exposed in a room full of New York's financial establishment with no clean exit. He'd worked with worse odds. That wasn't reassuring. It just meant he knew exactly how badly worse odds could go. He and Avery spent Monday evening on the burner phones going through it. She was in what he gathered was her apartment. He could hear the particular quality of urban quiet that meant high floor, good windows. The city reduced to something abstract and distant. He was at his kitchen table with the notebook open and a pen he kept clicking without meaning to, a habit Emma had told him was extremely annoying, which was fair. Walk me through the venue again, she said. The Meridian Foundation Gala is at the Whitfield Hotel, Park Avenue. Main ballroom is on the 2nd floor, accessed by a grand staircase from the lobby or a service elevator from the parking level. The parking level connects to a secondary underground garage that shares a wall with the building next door. He'd spent Sunday morning doing a walkthrough in civilian clothes, pretending to be checking out the hotel's event space for a corporate function, chatting with a coordinator who had been helpful without meaning to be. 3 street exits from the lobby, 1 service entrance on 45th. The ballroom has 2 emergency exits at the back. Where will Richard be? He RSVP'd as attending. Foundation donor, he's been on their gala list for 4 years. He'll be there from the start. These events, the people who are engineering something like to be positioned early. They like to watch arrival. He'll want to see me come in. Yes. And he'll want to see whether I'm with you or not. A pause. He's going to know something is wrong when you're there. Maybe. Depends on how he structured the operation. If he hired the Tuesday night piece out, if he used cutouts to make the call to me and arrange whatever is planned for that evening, he may not know immediately that I didn't comply. There's usually a lag between the moment something doesn't go as expected and the moment the person at the top of the chain finds out. How much lag? Enough, if we move fast. He clicked the pen again, caught himself, set it down. Here's what concerns me. We know Vale wants footage. We know he planned to use my background as the story. Unvetted driver, violent history, billionaire CEO, making dangerous choices. But I don't know yet exactly how he planned to generate the incident. What was supposed to happen to you at the gala that I was supposed to not be there to prevent? Something that looks like a scandal, Avery said. Not physical. You said that. Something reputational. Yes, but it needed to be dramatic enough to generate footage worth using, and it needed a clear story. The simplest version, someone approaches you, something is said or done or photographed. It gets out of context. It looks like you were involved in something damaging. He paused. The other option is that they were going to manufacture something from the outside and blame it on my presence. Security incident, altercation, something that gets framed as your driver being dangerous and you having poor judgment. They couldn't have known you'd be there, though. They told you not to be. They told me not to be. They also placed me in this job specifically, which means they knew my training, my instincts, and the fact that if I found a threat to you, I would respond to it. Maybe the call was a test. Maybe they knew there was a reasonable chance I'd refuse and show up anyway, and they built the story around that possibility. A longer silence this time. They built a trap that works either way, Avery said. That's what I keep coming back to, yes. If you don't show up, I'm unprotected and whatever incident they planned goes forward. And if I do show up, they have footage of the dangerous driver being exactly as dangerous as they said, and it becomes the story regardless of context. So the answer is to make sure we control the context. The answer is to make sure we control the recording. He pulled the notebook toward him. Which is why we need two things in place before Tuesday night. 1. Garrett on the exterior, watching for any setup crew that arrives before the event. 2. Our own camera inside the venue, running independently, in a position that captures the ballroom and the main access points. I can bring a small device, something that looks like an accessory. I was going to suggest that. It needs to be running from the moment you arrive, not just when something looks like it's happening. Evidence that starts rolling after the incident starts is easier to dismiss. Continuous footage is cleaner. I'll handle it. A pause. Mason, there's something I've been thinking about. Tell me, if Richard is there tonight, at the gala, and we get something on record, something that puts him in contact with whoever is running the operational side of this, that's enough for law enforcement. That's enough to go to the federal prosecutor who handled your original case. It's enough to start a conversation, he said carefully. It's not necessarily enough for the board. What do you mean? The board vote is in 3 weeks. Criminal process moves slowly. If Vail knows we're building a case, he moves the vote up, or he uses whatever he has on you now, before we can counter it, and gets control of the company first. Criminal prosecution doesn't stop a board vote. You need evidence that plays directly to the board members, not to a jury. Another pause. He could almost hear her working through it. Financial records, she said. The Briar Street Capital acquisition. The connection to my father's company. Yes, and the Sykes connection, and anything Helena Park found in the foundation donor records. She called me this afternoon, Avery said. She found Vail's name in the Meridian Foundation donor rolls. He came on board 22 months ago. Cole was released 14 months ago. The timing is off by 8 months. Mason frowned. 8 months before Cole got out. Someone was already building the connection. Someone knew Cole was getting released early and started positioning before it was public. Which means a federal contact, someone inside the bureau or the prosecutor's office who had access to Cole's timeline. He thought about that. Or Cole made contact himself from inside and Vail was already waiting. Helena is pulling the foundation's meeting minutes from that period. They're technically public record for a registered charitable organization, but they're not digitized and they're stored in a New Jersey records office, which means it takes time. How much time? She thinks by Thursday. That was 2 days after the gala. It was tight, but it was workable. Everything right now was workable and tight, which was a combination Mason had learned to function within, but never entirely got comfortable with. Tuesday night, he said. We get through Tuesday night. Then we see what Helena has. Then we build the board presentation. All right. She exhaled slowly. All right. I have a fitting tomorrow for the gala. I'll make sure the device is built into something I'm already wearing. Don't tell anyone in the building. I know how to keep a secret, Mason. I know you do. I'm saying it anyway. A small pause. Not hostile. Something slightly different. You're careful, she said, with a kind of observation quality that wasn't quite a complaint. I have a 7-year-old, he said. Careful is what I've got. Tuesday arrived the way significant days sometimes do, looking exactly like every other day until it didn't. Mason picked Avery up at the usual time for her morning appointments, and she got into the car the way she always did, phone in hand, coat on, not looking up. But she angled herself slightly differently in the back seat, and he understood that was about the small device now integrated into the clasp of what looked like an evening bag she was carrying for the first time. She did not look at him in the mirror. He did not look at her in the mirror. They were both very normal about this. He drove her to 2 morning meetings and a lunch, and at no point did anyone looking at the black Mercedes from the outside see anything other than a billionaire and her driver going about the ordinary business of a Tuesday. At 2:15, he dropped her at the Caldwell Industries building and drove the car to the parking garage. He did the full walk of the B2 level. The camera that had been repositioned was back in its original angle, which he found interesting. Someone had reset it, which meant someone knew it had been noticed, or someone was cleaning up the operational traces now that the timeline was in its final phase. He found no new badges, no new anomalies. The garage was exactly what it looked like, which meant the evening's action was elsewhere. He texted Garrett from the burner, arriving at venue at 8. Exterior south side, watch the service entrance. Garrett responded with a single period, which was his version of understood and confirmed. Mason went back to the apartment. Emma's door still open from the morning, room quiet, the stuffed elephant sitting on the bed with its mismatched thread trunk, looking slightly abandoned. And he changed into the dark suit he'd bought specifically for this kind of evening. The kind that let him stand in a room full of people dressed for wealth without looking like he was trying. He checked his jacket. The thing in his inside pocket was not a weapon. He hadn't carried a weapon in 2 years, partly because of Emma, partly because he decided at a certain point that living in the identity of a civilian meant actually making civilian choices, even the inconvenient ones. What he had instead was a secondary recording device, small enough to look like a pen clipped to a breast pocket, and Garrett's direct number on speed dial. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. He looked like a man in a suit who had spent a significant portion of his adult life doing things that didn't involve wearing suits and wasn't entirely comfortable in one. That was accurate. He smoothed the lapel and stopped looking. He picked Avery up at 8:45. She came out of the building looking like she was dressed to attend an event hosted by New York's charitable establishment, which was exactly what she was. Dark dress, understated but expensive, the evening bag at her wrist. Her expression was the one he'd come to recognize as her public face, composed, calibrated, giving away nothing. She got into the car and closed the door. "Garrett is in position," he said, pulling out. "Good." She looked out the window. "Richard texted me an hour ago, said he was looking forward to seeing me tonight and was glad I'd be attending given everything on my plate. He's checking." "I know." She paused. "I wrote back that I was looking forward to it." Mason drove. "There's one more thing Helena found," Avery said. "She called me 20 minutes ago." He waited. "Cliff Harmon, my security director, his previous employment before Caldwell Industries. He listed a private security consulting firm in the Mid-Atlantic region. Helena ran it." She paused. "The firm's registered agent was Martin Sykes." There it was, the interior of the operation. Harmon wasn't just a compromised employee, he was a placed one, in the same way Mason had been placed, but willing. He'd been inside Caldwell Industries for 3 years, managing the security infrastructure, deciding what got seen and what didn't, which cameras got serviced and when. "The modified badge," Mason said, "came from inside." "Yes." "And the camera repositioning?" "Presumably." He was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Harmon will be at the building tonight, not the gala, he doesn't attend those, but he'll have access to anything connected to the building's systems." "I know." She turned from the window and looked at the back of his head in the way that people looked at drivers when they wanted to make eye contact, but the geometry didn't allow it. "Can we do anything about that tonight?" "Not directly, but knowing he's a variable helps." He made a turn onto Park Avenue, the hotel now visible 2 blocks ahead, its entrance marked by the low light of an established institution that didn't need to announce itself. "We don't need to catch everyone tonight, we need to catch enough. Veil in contact with the operation, on record, with our camera running, that's what tonight is for." "And if something goes wrong?" He glanced in the mirror briefly. She was looking at him directly now. "Something will go wrong," he said. "It always does. The question is whether the thing that goes wrong is survivable." He pulled up toward the hotel entrance. "Stay visible. Stay in public spaces. If anyone pulls you towards somewhere private, you develop an urgent need to find me." "You'll be inside?" "I'll be at the periphery. Close enough." She nodded. She reached for the door handle, then stopped. "Mason." She said his name the way she'd started saying it in the past few days, without the driver-employer formality, but also without whatever was on the other side of that, The thing she kept carefully managed, somewhere in the middle. If this goes sideways tonight, it won't. But if it does. He turned to look at her properly, from the driver's seat, the full turn that the partition of roles usually made unnecessary. Then we deal with what we have, same as every other problem this week. She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded, once, and got out of the car. He watched her walk up the entrance steps and disappear through the glass doors of the Whitfield Hotel. Then he drove the car around to the service side of the block, parked it in a spot that gave him sight lines to two entrances, and settled in to wait the appropriate amount of time before going inside. The Whitfield Hotel ballroom was everything that kind of room always was. High ceilings, chandeliers operating at 30% of their actual capacity to suggest intimacy. Round tables with arrangements that cost more than most people's weekly grocery bills. A string quartet that nobody was quite listening to, but everyone appreciated being there. 500 people in formal wear circulating with the specific choreography of a class that has practiced this kind of event since birth. Mason came in through a side entrance on a vendor credential he'd arranged through a catering contact earlier in the week, which was a favor he'd now need to return in some form, but that was a Tuesday next week problem. He didn't look for Avery immediately. He did a slow circuit of the room first, mapping positions, identifying the clusters of people and the gaps between them. The security staff, 3 visible, probably 2 more he hadn't seen yet, and the locations of the emergency exits relative to the tables. He found a position near the east wall, behind a section of decorative screens that gave him a view of approximately 70% of the ballroom without being immediately visible himself. He found Richard Vale at minute 4. Vale was near the bar, which was predictable. People who are managing an operation and waiting for it to execute need something to do with their hands, and they gravitate toward the bar, not for the alcohol, but for the activity of holding a glass and having a reason to stand in a particular spot and watch. He was 62 and looked it in the way that men who've spent their lives in boardrooms look it, the weight of money and comfort in his posture, the silver at his temples that read as distinguished rather than aged. I was talking to a man Mason didn't recognize, gesturing slightly, relaxed, performing relaxed. Mason watched him for a few minutes. Vale's eyes moved to the main entrance every 30 seconds, regular as a metronome. He was waiting for Avery to arrive, and he was waiting for something else. The confirmation signal, Mason guessed, that whatever was planned for the evening was in position. He texted Garrett, "Anything on the south entrance?" The response came back in 40 seconds. 2 men, arrived separately, parked on opposite ends of the block, staying in vehicles. One has a camera unit telephoto pointed at the hotel entrance. So that was the mechanism. External photography, capturing Avery's arrival, capturing whatever incident was staged, framed from outside where the context would be whatever the photographer chose to show. Footage that could be edited, captioned, circulated before she even left the building. He texted back, "Keep positions, don't engage." Then he texted the burner, "Exterior has 2 men with cameras. Whatever happens tonight, it's designed to be photographed from outside. Don't go near the main entrance after 10. Her response came back quickly. "Understood." Richard just arrived at my table. Mason moved. He worked his way around the edge of the room, staying behind the circulation of guests, and found a new position that gave him a sight line to Avery's table without being in direct view of it. She was seated at a table near the center of the room, the kind of placement that meant she'd been assigned a position of prominence, which in this context meant a position of visibility. From outside, from a telephoto lens angled through the right window, the table would be clearly framed. Richard Vale was seated 2 chairs down from her, talking to the woman between them, but his body language was directed at Avery. Mason watched the way Vale's attention returned to her every few minutes, the way a person watches something they're managing rather than something they're enjoying. Avery was performing normally. She was talking, accepting a bread roll, laughing at something the person across from her said. The evening bag was at her wrist on the table. The device inside it was running. Mason settled in and watched. The incident, when it started, was subtle enough that he almost missed the beginning of it. A man approached the table from the left side. Not a server, dressed as a guest, moving with the relaxed entitlement of someone who belonged in rooms like this. He leaned down and said something to Avery. She looked up. Her expression stayed controlled, but her right hand moved slightly, tightening on the evening bag. The man handed her something, an envelope, small, cream-colored, the kind used for place cards or short personal notes. He smiled, said something else, and moved on. Mason watched Avery look at the envelope for a moment. She didn't open it. She set it on the table beside her bread plate. He watched Vale, 2 seats down, take a small sip of water and look carefully at nothing. Mason moved around the perimeter until he was near enough to the table to hear conversation without being part of it, which required positioning himself behind a group of men in conversation and keeping very still. The man who delivered the envelope was now on the far side of the room, near the bar. Not circulating, waiting. Avery's phone was in her hand under the table. Shit. He could see the slight movement of her thumb, the tap of a message being sent. His phone buzzed quietly in his jacket. Envelope delivered, not opening it. Man who brought it has a slight scar above his left eyebrow, gray suit, standing by the bar. I think I recognize him from somewhere. Caldwell Industries event, 18 months ago. Outside vendor. Mason looked at the man. Gray suit, left side of his face, the scar. He pulled the image into his memory and cross-referenced. The vendor events at Caldwell Industries were managed through, he already knew the answer before he finished the thought, managed through the facilities and security coordination, which ran through Cliff Harmon's office. He typed back, "Don't open the envelope. Keep it exactly where it is. Whatever's inside is the content they want photographed. You holding it, reacting to it, whatever it contains." A pause. Then, "You think it's something compromising. I think it's designed to look that way from outside. Don't give them the reaction." Another pause. Then, "Richard just leaned over. He's asking me what was in the envelope. He's performing curiosity." Mason watched Vale across the room. He was turned toward Avery now, the woman between them somehow no longer a factor, and he was wearing the expression of a man inquiring politely about a minor social curiosity. "Tell him you haven't opened it yet. Say it's probably a donor request. You'll look at it later." The response came back, "Done." He's smiling. He just said, "Of course," and turned away. Mason watched Vale turn away. Watched the small tightening around Vale's mouth that wasn't quite a smile. He was recalibrating. The envelope hadn't been opened immediately, which wasn't the expected behavior if it contained something genuinely scandalous. Most people opened envelopes at the table. The fact that Avery hadn't meant either she suspected something or she was simply less impulsive than they'd banked on. Either way, Vale was adjusting his timeline, which meant whatever came next was coming soon. Mason moved back toward the east wall and did a full scan of the room. And then he saw it. The thing he'd been missing, the thing that had been in place since before Avery arrived, and he simply hadn't identified it yet because it didn't look like a threat. The man with the gray suit and the scar wasn't the only one Vale had placed in the room. There was a second one, a woman, positioned near the emergency exit at the back. And a third, a man in a catering uniform who wasn't carrying anything and hadn't been near the kitchen in the 20 minutes Mason had been watching. Not external photographers. Not an envelope. The envelope was the distraction. He typed fast. "Get up from the table. Say you need the restroom. Go toward the north side of the room, not the south. Do it now." He was already moving before her response came back. He didn't read it. He was watching the man in the catering uniform change direction the moment Avery stood. A small pivot, almost invisible, the body language of someone tracking a target rather than carrying a tray. Mason came around the edge of the decorative screens and cut across the room at an angle that would intersect with Avery's path before the catering uniform could. He was 3 steps from her when Vale appeared. Not from the table, from the side, as if he'd been standing near the edge of the room and drifted naturally into her path. It looked, to anyone watching, like a host who'd seen a guest getting up and taken the opportunity to say something. "Avery," Vale said warmly, with the particular warmth of a man who had practiced warmth for 8 years. "You look wonderful. Are you enjoying yourself?" Avery stopped. She looked at him. And Mason, arriving at her side, watched her face in the fraction of a second before she arranged it, watched the thing that moved across it, the thing she had been carrying since he'd told her about Briar Street Capitol and the hospital room. "And I'm sorry I couldn't have done more." She arranged it. "Richard," she said, with a smile that was completely convincing to anyone who hadn't been watching her practice exactly this performance for the past week. "I was just heading to find Mason. I needed to speak with him about the pickup time." Vale looked at Mason, and for a moment, one specific moment, the warmth dropped. It was fast. A half second at most, but Mason had spent 15 years learning to read the unguarded half second. What he saw was recognition of a specific kind. Not just this is the driver, but something more calculated. This is the man who was supposed to not be here. And underneath that, the rapid recalibration of someone who understood that a variable had failed to perform as designed. Of course, Vale said, the warmth back in place like a mask snapped back after a gust of wind. He looked at Mason with an expression of courteous neutrality. Reed, isn't it? Yes, sir, Mason said. Vale looked between them. It's good to have reliable staff, he said to Avery, in a tone that managed to be simultaneously complimentary and diminishing. Your father would have appreciated that. He was very loyal to the people around him. Mason felt Avery go very still beside him. It was a deliberately cruel thing to say, said perfectly, with the smile and the warmth fully deployed in a room where no one else would hear the knife in it. Your father, who had been betrayed by someone he trusted, who had died in a hospital room, who had lost everything, said by the man who had profited from that loss and spent 8 years building a second chance to do it again. Avery said very calmly, yes, he was. And then she stepped past him and kept walking toward the north side of the room. Mason stayed for exactly 1 additional second, long enough to see something shift in Vale's eyes. Not anger, something colder, a decision being made. And then he followed her. They didn't speak until they were in a corridor behind the ballroom, a service hallway used for catering access, where the sound of the string quartet became an ambient murmur through the wall. Avery was walking fast. She stopped when she reached a dead end where the corridor turned back toward the kitchen, and she stood for a moment with her back to him, both hands on the wall, not quite leaning on it, breathing. He knows, Mason said. Yes. She turned around. Her expression was back in control, but her eyes were doing something different. The specific look of someone processing a pain they'd had to put down in the middle of a room full of people and are only now picking back up. He looked at you, and he knew. Which means the timeline moves up. Whatever they had planned for tonight, it either happens in the next 30 minutes or it doesn't happen at all. She nodded. She pressed her fingers against the side of the evening bag where the device was running. We got him on that, Mason said. His voice, that exchange. It doesn't prove conspiracy, but it puts him on record. It's not enough. I know. We need the operational piece. We need one of the men in that room to connect to him on record. She looked at him. The catering uniform. He's placed. He's not there to serve food, which means he's there to do something specific. If we can identify him. I have better, Avery said. She reached into the evening bag and produced her phone. The regular one, not the burner, the Caldwell Industries device. She navigated to something and turned the screen toward him. A security notification. From the building's parking system, forwarded to her phone because she had executive access to the building's alerts. Someone had just used an access card to enter the Caldwell Industries underground garage. At 9:58 p.m. The card belonged to Cliff Harmon. He's in the building, Mason said. He shouldn't be. There's nothing scheduled, no events, no reason for a security director to badge into a parking garage on a Tuesday night. She looked at the screen. He's doing something to the building, to the systems, before the board vote. Mason thought fast. The gala was the visible piece, the photography, the envelope, the positioned people. But a board vote required documentation, financial evidence, system records. If Harmon was in the building tonight, he was doing something to the records. Your attorney, Helena. She's in Jersey. Call her, right now. Have her file an emergency legal hold on all Caldwell Industries financial records as of tonight. Anything Harmon accesses or modifies after 9 p.m. is covered by that hold. It creates a timestamp. He was already reaching for his own phone. I'm calling someone who can get into that building remotely and mirror the current state of the financial servers before Harmon touches them. You have someone who can do that? I know someone who knows someone. Which was technically true and also significantly understating the nature of the contact, but this wasn't the moment for full disclosure of his residual intelligence community adjacencies. Mason. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the logistics. If Harmon is in the building, that's physical evidence. Footage, access logs, his actual presence in the system at a time he has no legitimate reason to be there. Yes, that's what we need, not what Vale said in a ballroom. Harmon in the building, the access logs, the financial records before and after. That's the board presentation. She was right. He'd been so focused on the gala, on what was happening in this room, that he'd missed the actual operational center of gravity. The gala was noise. Harmon in the building tonight was the signal. "You need to go back into the ballroom," he said. She blinked. "What?" "You need to go back in there, sit at your table, and be completely visible for the next 45 minutes. If Vale sees you disappear, if he loses track of you, he calls Harmon. If he thinks you're sitting at a charity dinner having a normal Tuesday night, Harmon has all the time he needs and he doesn't rush and he makes mistakes." He looked at her. "We need Harmon to think tonight is going perfectly." Avery stared at him. He could see her working through it, the part of her that wanted to do something active warring with the part of her that understood that doing nothing visible was sometimes the most effective action available. "And you?" she said. "I'm going to the building. Now. Now." She looked at him for a long moment. "If Richard notices you're gone, tell him I had a family matter. Tell him my daughter called." He paused. "It'll read as true. People hear what confirms what they already think. He thinks I'm a man with a vulnerable daughter I can be pressured through. Use it." Her jaw tightened slightly. Not at the suggestion. She understood the strategy. At the fact of what it required her to do, which was walk back into a room with Richard Vale and perform normalcy for 45 minutes while knowing everything she now knew about who he was. "Okay," she said, just the one word. She said it the way she'd said it at the diner. The way a person says something they mean completely and without any particular satisfaction about meaning it. She went back toward the ballroom door. "Avery." She stopped, hand on the door. "The device is still running?" She glanced down at the evening bag. "Yes." "Good. Get everything. What he says, who he talks to. All of it." She nodded once and went through the door. Shut. Mason came out of the service exit onto 45th Street and moved fast, keeping to the building line, away from the exterior positions Garrett was watching. He texted Garrett as he walked. "Nothing more coming from the venue tonight. Stay for cover. Text me if the photography crew moves." The Caldwell Industries building was 7 blocks north. He walked because a cab left a record, and running left a signal, and walking at a slightly accelerated pace on a Manhattan Tuesday night was approximately invisible. He badged into the building with the credential that Avery had. In a conversation 2 days ago that she had carefully framed as administrative access for emergency situations, added to his driver profile. He'd noted at the time that she was covering this possibility without saying she was covering this possibility, and he'd found that quietly impressive. The lobby was mostly empty. A night security guard at the desk, who Mason had seen twice before and nodded to, who nodded back and went back to his phone. The elevators were in their late-night mode, slower and fewer in rotation. He didn't take the elevator. He took the stairs to the B2 level. The stairwell door opened onto the parking level, and he immediately saw what he'd missed the first time. Not from the stairwell, which was too narrow an angle, but from the foot of the stairs looking across the lot. The lights were different. Not all of them. Not obviously. But the coverage on the far left corner of the B2 level, near the secondary entrance corridor that connected to the service elevator bank, was lower than it should have been. The same camera that had been repositioned and then reset was now angled differently again, this time toward the secondary corridor rather than the parking spaces. Someone had been here recently. Mason moved carefully through the lot, staying in the shadows of the support columns, listening. He heard it before he saw it, the particular quality of footsteps that belonged to someone who thought they were alone. Deliberate, but not cautious. The footsteps of someone conducting business they believed was unobserved. Cliff Harmon was in the secondary corridor, at a terminal panel on the wall, a laptop open on the shelf below it. He was working quickly but without urgency. His back was to the corridor entrance. Mason watched for 30 seconds. Harmon was connected directly to the building's security infrastructure, not through the network, which would leave a cleaner record, but through a physical hardline port in the panel. Whatever he was doing it in a way designed to limit the digital trace. It was competent work. It was the work of someone who knew security systems from the inside. Mason had his phone in his hand and was recording. He was about to step back and call the federal contact he'd been saving for exactly the level of need that this had now become, when the lights in the B2 level went out. Not a flicker. A complete cut. Total darkness. Harmon swore from the corridor, a sharp, surprised sound. His laptop screen was the only light visible, a pale rectangle at the far end. Mason stood very still. And then the service entrance at the far side of the lot opened, and 4 figures came through it, and Mason understood in the space of 1 second that this had never been about Harmon alone, and the board vote was not the endgame. Richard Vale was eliminating variables, including Avery. He was already moving when his phone lit up with a text from the burner. Avery's number, 2 words. He left. Vale had left the gala. Mason ran. He came out of the column shadows at a full sprint across the parking level, and the 4 figures heard him and turned. And in the pale rectangle of Harmon's laptop screen and the thin emergency strip lighting that had clicked on at the far wall, he got a clear look at what had just entered this parking garage. 4 men. Not subtle, not dressed for a charity gala, dressed for work. And behind them, through the still open service door, he heard the sound of heels on concrete, someone coming down from the hotel corridor, someone who had clearly been directed to come here, someone who didn't yet know what was waiting in the dark. Avery. Vale had called her, or texted her, or had someone else do it, had given her a reason to come to the garage, to her own building, in the middle of a charity event, at a time when Mason was supposed to be gone. Except Mason was here. He placed himself between her and the 4 men in the same moment she came through the service door, and the emergency lighting caught both of them, and she saw him, and she stopped. He said, very clearly, without raising his voice, "Go back through that door." She didn't move. She was looking at the 4 men, processing, and then she looked at him, and whatever she saw and how he was standing made her press back against the door frame rather than retreating. Not staying out of stubbornness, but staying because she understood, in the functional way of someone smart enough to read a tactical situation, that the door at her back was cover. The 4 men spread into a loose formation. Professional spacing, not random street muscle. The tallest of the 4 said, to no one in particular, "The driver's here." One of the others said, flatly, without inflection, "Walsh will want to know." And Mason went very still for a different reason. Walsh. The name from his past. Not Cole, not Sykes, but the one he'd thought was presumed dead. The 4th man from Meridian Tactical Group. The one who hadn't gone to prison and hadn't cooperated and had simply disappeared. Not dead, just patient. The first man looked at Mason with the specific quality of professional assessment, measuring capability, calculating odds, deciding. "You should have stayed at the party," he said. "Probably," Mason agreed. And then the first man moved, and Mason moved, and the parking garage became a place where the ordinary Tuesday night ended, and something else entirely began. He was not the man he'd been at 28, when the work was cleaner and faster, and he'd had a full team at his back and no daughter's face in his head when things got difficult. He was 32 and out of practice in the specific physical ways that 2 years of driving a car, instead of doing the other thing, made you out of practice. But muscle memory is not the same as habit. Muscle memory is structural. It lives in the body below the level of thought. And it came back the way it always came back. Not like riding a bicycle, nothing that gentle. More like a language you grew up speaking that you thought you'd lost until someone speaks it to you and your mouth opens and the words are already there. He went through 3 of the 4 men with the controlled precision of someone who had made a specific decision years ago about what kind of force he would and wouldn't use. And he held to that decision even here, even in this garage, even with Avery pressed against the doorframe behind him, watching something she had not been prepared to see. The 4th man grabbed him from behind, and in the struggle said something that was not directed at Mason but into a device at his collar, said it in the way people say things they don't realize they're saying aloud because the situation has exceeded their operational plan. Reed is the asset. He's the real asset. They want him on camera. Walsh has the secondary feed. And then Mason broke the hold in a way that ended the conversation. And the 4th man went down, and the parking garage was quiet, except for the sound of the emergency strip lighting and Harmon somewhere in the secondary corridor, making the sounds of someone who had been watching all of this and was now making different calculations about his own situation. Mason stood in the middle of the B2 level. He was breathing harder than he wanted to be. He had a cut above his left eye from something in the 3rd exchange that he hadn't tracked at the time, which was the kind of thing that happened when you were managing multiple vectors simultaneously and your body made triage decisions without consulting you. He turned. Avery was still at the doorframe. She was looking at him. He became aware, in the way you become aware of something after the immediate need for it has passed, that she had been holding her phone up. Recording. Not just the device in the evening bag. Her actual phone, screen facing out, pointed at the garage floor where 4 men were in various states of incapacitation. She looked at the phone. She looked at him. She said, in a voice that was remarkably steady for someone who had just watched her driver work his way through 4 professional-grade hired men in a parking garage. They said Walsh. They said secondary feed. I know. Walsh has his own recording of this. Yes. Which means he planned to use this footage to... She stopped. They were going to frame this. Your face, this garage, 4 men down. Without context, it looks like exactly what Vale planned to make it look like, Mason said. Yes. She looked at the 4 men, at the garage, at the camera in the corner that Harmon had repositioned. But we have the context, she said slowly. Mason looked at her. Your recording started first, she said, at the gala, and mine started when I came through that door. And whatever Walsh has on his secondary feed starts. She looked at the positions of the men, the geometry of it. It starts after you were already in position between me and them. He has footage of you protecting me, not attacking, protecting. Mason hadn't gotten there yet. He'd been operating in the immediate, in the physical accounting of what had just happened and what came next. But she was right. She was completely right. The secondary feed Walsh had intended as evidence of dangerous, violent, reckless. It was footage of a man standing between 4 attackers and the person they'd been sent to get to. Richard Vale's trap had just become something else. Mason looked at her. She looked back at him. There was something in her expression that wasn't triumph. It was quieter than that, more complicated, the expression of someone who has just seen a thing confirmed that they suspected but hadn't wanted to be sure of. He was going to let them hurt you, she said. Yes. Not just destroy the company, actually. Yes, Mason said. She absorbed that. From the secondary corridor, Harmon's voice came through the concrete quiet, higher than it had been, stripped of the professional steadiness. I want to talk to someone. I have information. I want to talk to someone who can... I want to make a deal. Mason and Avery looked at each other. And in the particular silence of a parking garage where the night's plan had just come apart, where 4 men were on the ground and a security director was offering to confess, and the devices between them had been recording since 9 p.m., Avery Caldwell did something Mason hadn't seen her do once in 3 weeks. She laughed. Not a happy laugh. Not the laugh of someone for whom things had gone perfectly. The laugh of someone standing in a dark parking garage in a gala dress with a cut-up recording of attempted corporate espionage, and a driver who looked like he'd been in a fight, which he had, and who understood suddenly and completely that this was what winning sometimes looked like. Messy and expensive and nothing like the movies. Okay, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, already shifting back into something operational. Okay, we need to call Helena. We need to call the federal prosecutor's office. We need to secure whatever Harmon was doing to the servers before he had time to finish it. She straightened her dress, pushed her hair back. And we need to figure out where Richard Vale went. Mason was already pulling out his phone. Garrett can track the exterior from the gala. If Vale's car left Park Avenue in the last 20 minutes, I have the building's vehicle access logs. If he tries to come here, he won't come here, Mason said. He'll know by now that this didn't go the way it was supposed to. He'll be making different calls. He looked at her. He's going to try to accelerate the board vote. Move it up before we can build the presentation. She nodded slowly. The laugh was gone. What was underneath it was something that had been building for 3 weeks. The particular expression of someone who has been afraid of a thing and has now decided to stop being afraid of it, not because it isn't dangerous anymore, but because the alternative is worse. Then we have until he figures out how fast he can move it, she said. Let's make sure we move faster. Harmon talked for 3 hours. He sat in a chair in the building's second-floor conference room, not the executive suite, not anywhere near the server room he'd been attempting to access. And he talked with the particular desperate velocity of a man who has run the numbers and understood that the only remaining commodity he has is information, and that its value depreciates with every hour he waits to spend it. Helena Park arrived at 11:40 p.m., still in the blazer she'd been wearing to dinner when Avery called, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and a legal pad in her hand, and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this specific phone call for approximately 3 years without knowing exactly what form it would take. She sat up at the head of the conference table and began writing before Harmon had finished his first sentence. Mason sat in the corner with a paper towel pressed against the cut above his eye and listened. He wasn't the primary audience for Harmon's confession, but he was listening for something specific, the name Walsh, the operational details that connected the garage ambush to the larger conspiracy. Anything that told him where Darren Cole's former attorney and Richard Vale's network intersected at the practical level. That was the layer below the board vote story, the layer that involved federal jurisdiction and Mason's own buried past, and he needed to understand its shape before he could figure out what it meant for Emma's safety going forward, because Walsh was still out there. That was the thing he kept returning to while Harmon talked and Helena wrote and Avery sat across the table with her hands flat on the surface. The same posture she'd had at Whitmore's diner on Monday morning, steadying herself without wanting it to show. Walsh. Presumed dead. Not dead. Patient in the way that only certain kinds of people were patient, the kind who understood that revenge had a longer shelf life than most people thought, and that the best time to collect it was when the person who'd wronged you believed the threat had passed. Harmon was describing the financial architecture, how the manipulation had been structured across 3 separate reporting periods, using rounding discrepancies in subsidiary accounts to create a pattern that looked, in aggregate, like evidence of executive mismanagement. Nothing that would hold up in a forensic audit, the numbers were too carefully constructed to be real fraud. But enough, presented selectively to board members who were already inclined to doubt Avery, to raise sufficient question about her stewardship to swing a vote. Who built the financial model? Helena asked, without looking up from her legal pad. Harmon paused. Sykes provided the structure. I implemented it. Martin Sykes gave you a model for manipulating Caldwell Industries' financial records. He gave me a framework. He said it was a financial narrative adjustment. He called corporate fraud a narrative adjustment, Helena said flatly. He's a lawyer, Harmon said, as if this explained something. Helena wrote something on her legal pad with slightly more force than necessary. Avery hadn't moved. She was looking at Harmon with an expression that Mason found difficult to read precisely. Not anger, or not only that, something more like the controlled exhaustion of someone absorbing the full scope of a betrayal that has been unfolding slowly for years and is only now completely visible. How long? She said. It wasn't quite a question. Harmon looked at her. Ms. Caldwell, how long have you been working against this company? A pause. From the beginning, he said. My placement here was arranged before the interview, before the job posting. He looked at the table. I was told it was competitive intelligence work. Reporting back on operational structure, internal relationships. That's how it started. And then it became more. Gradually. He said it like the word was supposed to mean something, like gradualness was a mitigating factor. It didn't feel like one decision. It felt like a series of small things that, were you in that garage tonight? Avery said. Harmon stopped. Those 4 men. Were you part of what was planned for me in that garage? A longer pause this time. I was told to disable the lighting system and reposition the camera, he said. I wasn't told. I didn't know they intended to. I thought it was about the recording, getting the footage of your driver in a compromising situation. You thought disabling the lights in a parking garage where I was going to be alone was just about footage, Avery said. Harmon didn't answer. Okay, she said. Not the way she'd said it at the diner or in the service hallway. This one was shorter, harder, the period at the end of a line of thinking. She looked at Helena. I think we have enough for tonight. Make sure everything is recorded and get the emergency legal hold filed before midnight. Already filed at 10:40, Helena said, capping her pen. I filed it from my car on the way over. Avery nodded. She stood. She looked at Harmon one more time, briefly, the way you look at something you are deciding to stop looking at. You'll make yourself available to the federal prosecutor's office tomorrow morning. It wasn't a question either. Harmon nodded. Avery walked out. Mason followed her into the corridor and they stood for a moment in the particular quiet of an office building at midnight, when the ventilation sounds become audible because everything else has gone still. Walsh, she said. Yes. You need to tell me about Walsh. He did. Standing in a hallway with the cut above his eye dried to a thin, dark line and the sounds of Helena organizing paperwork on the other side of the conference room door, he told her the parts he hadn't told her yet. The fourth man from Meridian Tactical Group, the one who hadn't been caught, who'd been listed as presumed dead in the case file, and who had appeared tonight in the words of one of the garage crew, like a name that was supposed to mean something. She listened without interrupting, the way she always listened. When he finished, she said, "He's the connection point between your past and Vale's operation. Cole knew my identity and sold it, probably through Sykes. Walsh provided the operational capability, the men, the surveillance, the setup. Vale provided the money and the motive." He leaned against the corridor wall. Three separate actors who needed each other. Vale couldn't do the operational piece alone. Walsh needed financial backing and a legitimate target. Cole needed protection and resources after his release. "A transaction," she said. "They traded what they each had." "Yes." "And Walsh? Where is he now?" "I don't know," Mason said, which was the honest answer and also the answer he liked least. "The four men in the garage are in police custody. Harmon is contained. Sykes will know something happened tonight within hours, and he'll either run or contact Walsh." He paused. "Walsh knows the operation failed. He knows I was in that garage and I'm not a person who loses and stays quiet." "He'll come for Emma," Avery said. Not a question. "He'll try to use Emma as a reset," Mason said, "to get me to back off the federal case, to remove me from whatever is building against Vale, to buy time." He straightened. "Emma is in Philadelphia with someone Walsh doesn't know about and can't easily trace. That gives me time, but not much." "What do you need?" He thought about it. "I need Walsh in federal custody before the board meeting. If he's loose, he's a variable I can't manage from a conference room." "How do you find someone who's been invisible for 2 years?" "You make him come to you," Mason said. She looked at him carefully. "You're going to use yourself as the target." "I'm already the target. I'm just going to stop moving away from it." She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved across her face that she didn't arrange away fast enough. Something that had nothing to do with board votes or legal holds or financial evidence, something more immediate and less manageable than any of that. "Be careful," she said. It was a simple thing. People said it all the time, reflexively, meaninglessly. She said it like she meant the specific words, like careful was something she was genuinely asking for, not a formality. "I've got a 7-year-old waiting for me in Philadelphia," he said. "Careful is the only speed I've got." He called his federal contact at 1 a.m. from the roof of his building, the same spot where he'd called Garrett a week earlier. The contact, a woman named Briggs, who had been his primary handler during the original Meridian Tactical Group prosecution, and who had, in the years since, maintained the kind of careful professional distance that was her version of still caring what happened to him, answered on the third ring with the tone of someone who had not been asleep and was not going to pretend otherwise. "You're going to tell me Walsh is alive," she said. "Walsh is alive," he confirmed. A silence. Not surprise. The silence of someone who had suspected this and is not enjoying being right. "How do you know?" He told her about the garage, about the operational crew, the secondary recording setup, the name that had come out of one of the men during the ambush, in the way that names come out when a plan has gone sideways and people stop editing themselves. "Reed," she said when he finished, "you were running an independent counter-operation in a parking garage." "I was protecting my employer." "You were—" She stopped. He could hear her deciding not to have this argument. "How solid is the evidence against Vale?" "Solid enough for a federal conspiracy charge if you move fast. The attorney angle, Sykes, gives you the financial routing. Harmon gives you the internal operation. The garage gives you the physical conspiracy." He paused. "But Walsh is still loose, and if he gets to my daughter before you get to him, everything else becomes secondary." "Where is she?" "Somewhere he can't reach her yet. I need that window to close." Briggs was quiet for a moment. He could hear her doing what she always did when she was working through a decision, a slight sound, almost inaudible, like she was counting something. "I can put out a federal locate on Walsh within the hour," she said. "But Reed, if we move on this, it moves fast. Grand jury, warrants, the whole machinery. You and the Caldwell woman are central witnesses. You understand what that means. It means we're visible. It means you are specifically visible. Your identity, your history, your testimony, in the original case, all of it becomes part of the public record. The protected identity is over. He'd known this was coming. He'd known it since Monday night when he'd decided not to stay quiet. It was the same calculation he'd made the first time in a federal prosecutor's office at 28, when he'd understood that the cost of speaking was high and the cost of silence was higher. "I know," he said. "Your daughter, Emma, knows my name is Mason Reed. She knows I was in the Navy. When she's old enough, I'll tell her the rest." He looked out at the city, the particular dark warmth of Manhattan at 1 in the morning. "She'll be fine. Kids are more resilient than we think." He wasn't entirely sure he believed the last part, but he believed the part about telling her eventually, and he believed that Emma, who argued about leftover rice and carried a library book about deep-sea fish everywhere she went, and repaired the same stuffed elephant twice rather than replace it, was fundamentally okay in the ways that mattered. "All right," Briggs said. "I'll move tonight. Don't do anything with Walsh yourself if you find him first." "Briggs? Reed. Find him fast," he said. Walsh found Mason first, not in person, through Emma. The call came Wednesday morning at 7:40 from Mrs. Okafor's Philadelphia number, and when Mason answered, it was not Mrs. Okafor's voice on the line. It was a man's voice, calm, unhurried, the voice of someone who had been working toward a specific moment for a long time, and was now inside it and felt no need to rush. "She's fine," the voice said, before Mason could speak. "I want you to know that first. She's fine, she's safe. Mrs. Okafor is sitting right here beside her, and no one has touched either of them. I want to be clear about that." Mason was standing in his kitchen. He was very still. "Walsh," he said, "you sound surprised. I thought you'd figured it out." "I figured out you were alive. I didn't know you'd moved this fast." "I had to. Things went sideways last night, as you're aware." A pause. "Here's what I need, Mason, and I'm going to call you Mason because we worked together for 3 years, and I think we're past the formalities. What I need is simple. You remove yourself from the Vail situation. Whatever you've given the federal prosecutor's office, you walk it back. Insufficient evidence, unreliable witness, whatever story works. Vail gets his board vote, he gets what he's been building toward, and the piece of this that involves your history goes away. All of it. Your name goes back in the box. And Emma. Emma goes home, today. You drive to Philadelphia and pick her up yourself, and she never knows any of this happened." Mason was quiet for a moment. "I was doing the thing he'd learned to do in situations where the pressure was designed to produce an immediate emotional response. He was letting the pressure sit there without responding to it, feeling its shape, understanding what it was built from. Walsh had Emma's location. He had physical proximity to her. But he'd said, specifically and immediately, that she was fine and unharmed, and he'd said it in a way that was designed to forestall the kind of response that made people dangerous. Walsh didn't want a confrontation. He wanted a transaction, which meant he was managing his own exposure. "Let me talk to her," Mason said. A brief pause. Then Emma's voice. "Dad?" She sounded confused and a little annoyed, which was exactly how Emma sounded when something had interrupted her morning that she hadn't planned for. Not frightened, not hurt, confused and annoyed. "Hey, Em," he said. "Are you okay?" "There's a man here and he won't let Mrs. Okafor make breakfast, and I was supposed to have waffles." "I know. I'm going to sort it out, okay? Can you be patient for a little while?" "How long is a little while?" "Not long," he said. "Is Mrs. Okafor okay?" "She's kind of scared," Emma said, with the particular candor of a 7-year-old who reports information without editorializing. "She keeps holding my hand. Tell her I said hi and I'm coming." "Okay." A pause. "Dad, this man smells like cigarettes." "I know, Em. Give the phone back now." Walsh came back on. "Good kid," he said. "Pragmatic. She'll be fine as long as this is simple." "It's going to be simple," Mason said. "Good. 12 hours. You sort out the federal piece, you call this number, I walk away. Everyone goes home." 12 hours, Mason confirmed. He hung up. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and pressed both palms flat on the surface and breathed for exactly 30 seconds. The specific breathing technique that a SEAL instructor had taught him at 23 for the moments when the situation required you to not operate from the reactive part of your brain. It didn't make the fear go away. It put it in the right place, where it could inform rather than drive. Emma was confused and annoyed about the waffles. She was fine. He picked up his phone and called Briggs. "Walsh has my daughter," he said when she answered. "Philadelphia. I have the number he called from. He's expecting a 12-hour window." A sharp intake of breath. "Reed, she's unharmed. He's managing his exposure. He doesn't want a direct confrontation. He wants a transaction, which means he's alone or close to it. He can't have a large crew with him, or someone would have seen something at Mrs. Okafor's building." "How confident are you in that assessment?" 70%. Honest number. But his behavior on the phone was consistent with someone operating at the edge of their resources. The garage crew is in custody. Harmon is contained. Sykes is probably running. Walsh is out of network. That makes him more dangerous, not less. "It makes him more negotiable," Mason said. "He called me instead of doing something. He's looking for a way to walk away from this. He's looking for leverage." Same thing, from his perspective. Mason stood. "I'm going to Philadelphia." "Reed, do not—" "I'm going to Philadelphia to get my daughter," he said clearly. "What you do in the next 6 hours determines whether that's all I do." He gave her the number Walsh had called from, the address of Mrs. Okafor's daughter's building in Philadelphia from his memory, and the physical description of Walsh that he'd been carrying in his head since a tactical briefing in a different life. Then he called Avery on the burner. She answered before the first ring completed, which meant she'd been waiting. "I heard," she said. He hadn't said anything yet. "Helena called me." Briggs contacted Helena's office to verify the Caldwell evidence chain. "She told me about Emma." "She's okay." "I know. Helena told me." A pause. "What do you need?" "Nothing you can give me right now," he said. "Walsh has to be handled by the federal side. I'm going to Philadelphia. I'm staying on the periphery until Briggs moves." "And if Briggs doesn't move in time?" He was already putting his jacket on. "Then I handle it the other way." A silence. "Mason," her voice was careful, "don't do something that costs you more than it costs him." He understood what she meant. She'd watched him in that garage 3 nights ago, watched him make specific decisions in real time about what kind of force he would and wouldn't use, watched him hold to those decisions even when the situation would have justified more. She'd seen the line he'd drawn for himself. She was asking him not to step over it just because his daughter was on the other side. "I know," he said. "She's going to be okay." "Yes," he said. "She is." He drove to Philadelphia. Briggs moved in 4 hours and 40 minutes. She moved with a federal tactical team and 2 Philadelphia field agents who had Walsh's location from the phone number trace before Mason had crossed into New Jersey, and she had the good professional sense to call Mason when they were 10 minutes out rather than after. "Stay in your car," she said. "Whatever happens, stay in the car." He was parked half a block from Mrs. Okafor's daughter's building, in a spot that gave him a sight line to the main entrance. He'd been there for an hour and 40 minutes. He'd been watching the building, tracking movement, the way he always tracked, exits, windows, the 2 spots where a person could stand and see the entrance without being obvious. He'd seen Walsh once, briefly, in a window on the 3rd floor. Walsh looked older than Mason remembered. The 2 years since Meridian Tactical Group had not been kind years. The posture was still controlled, still professional, but there was something worn around the edges of him that hadn't been there before. The particular deterioration of a man who has been running a long time without a place to land. "I'll stay in the car," Mason said. He stayed in the car. It took 11 minutes. He watched 4 agents enter the building from 2 different access points, and he watched the specific quality of stillness that fell over the block in those 11 minutes. The kind that people who live in cities recognize unconsciously, the way foot traffic adjusts around something happening without knowing what it is. Then Briggs called. "He's in custody," she said. "Unharmed. He didn't resist. I told you he was looking for a way out." "Emma." "Her and Mrs. Okafor are being brought down now. There's a female agent with them." A pause. She asked if she could still have waffles. Mason put the phone down on the passenger seat. He got out of the car. He stood on the sidewalk. Emma came out of the building with a federal agent on one side and Mrs. Okafor on the other, and she was carrying the library book about deep-sea fish, which meant at some point in the morning she had retrieved it from wherever she'd put it and held on to it through everything. And when she saw Mason, she ran the way she always ran. Like forward momentum was the only thing keeping the whole operation together. He caught her and didn't say anything. She smelled like the shampoo Mrs. Okafor always bought for her when she stayed over, and she was squeezing his jacket with both fists in the way she did when she was trying not to cry, which meant she'd been more scared than she'd let the man with the cigarettes see. "Hey," he said, into the top of her head. "Hey, I've got you." "The waffles," she said. Her voice was smaller than usual. "We'll get waffles. Right now, wherever you want." She pulled back far enough to look at him. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying, because Emma Reed had her father's particular stubbornness about certain things. "Are we going home?" "Yes," he said. "We're going home." She looked at the cut above his eye, healed to a thin line now, but still visible. She'd seen it this morning when he'd arrived and hadn't asked about it then, which meant she was asking now. "Did somebody hit you?" "I bumped into something." She gave him the look that meant she knew he was not telling the full truth, but was choosing to accept the abbreviated version for the moment. She'd been doing that look since she was 5. It was disconcertingly accurate. "Can we really get waffles?" she said. "Yes." "Mrs. Okafor too?" He looked at Mrs. Okafor, who had been standing at a respectful distance holding Emma's stuffed elephant, and who now looked like someone who had been through an experience they would be processing for some time but was holding together with considerable dignity. "Mrs. Okafor too," he said, "wherever she wants." He drove back to New York that evening with Emma asleep in the back seat, the library book open on her chest where it had fallen when she drifted off somewhere around Trenton. Mrs. Okafor was in the passenger seat, telling him in a low, steady voice about the morning, the knock at the door, the man who'd been polite in a deliberate way that she'd recognized immediately as not actually polite, the way she'd kept Emma close and kept talking to her about ordinary things to keep the child calm. "You were good," Mason said. "You did the right things." "I know I did," Mrs. Okafor said, with the particular dignity of someone who does not require external confirmation of their own competence. "I want to know that you're going to make sure it doesn't happen again." "It won't happen again." "You're telling me that as a fact?" "Yes." She looked at him for a moment, then out the windshield at the highway. "She told the man his operation smelled like cigarettes," she said. "She told me that too." He laughed. A pause. "I think it surprised him. He was prepared for crying. He wasn't prepared for Emma." Mason glanced in the rearview mirror at the sleeping shape of his daughter, the library book rising and falling slowly on her chest. "Nobody ever is," he said. The 10 days between the garage and the emergency board meeting were the most procedurally complex of Mason's adult life, and he'd once spent 6 days providing continuous surveillance coverage on a target in a foreign city without sleep. The difference was that tactical operations had clean edges. You knew when you were inside one and when you were outside. The thing with Avery and Caldwell Industries and federal prosecutors and financial records and board governance had no clean edges. It bled continuously into everything, required decisions he wasn't trained to make, and involved a level of paperwork that he found genuinely alienating. But he got through it. With Briggs managing the federal side and Helena managing the legal architecture, and Avery managing the board relationships with a combination of precision and controlled anger that Mason found impressive and occasionally alarming, they got through it. Sykes was picked up at JFK attempting to board a flight to Zurich on the Thursday after the garage. His arrest, combined with the evidence chain that Helena had assembled, gave the federal prosecutor enough to move on Vail directly. Vail was not arrested immediately. Briggs explained, with the patience of someone who had explained legal process to non-lawyers many times, that the stronger move was to let Vail arrive at the board meeting, believing the operation had merely been disrupted rather than dismantled, that he still had a viable path to board control, that the evidence against him was incomplete. "You want him in the room," Avery said, on a call that included Mason, Briggs, and Helena. "I want him in the room presenting his motion," Briggs confirmed. "At which point the witnesses enter and the motion fails, and we have him on record making his play with full knowledge of the conspiracy that preceded it. He'll have attorneys. He'll have very expensive attorneys, who will not be able to undo video footage, financial records, a confession from his place security director, and 2 independent witnesses." A pause. "He'll also have the Briar Street Capital acquisition on record. That's not a criminal charge. That's a civil matter, your attorney's territory. But it establishes the pattern of conduct to the board in a way that makes the conspiracy comprehensible." "I want them to understand it," Avery said. "I don't just want him removed. I want them to understand what was built and how long it took. Then make sure your presentation includes the timeline, Briggs said. Start with your father's company. The board meeting was on a Thursday morning at 9 a.m. in the Caldwell Industries Executive Conference Room on the 34th floor, and Mason drove Avery there himself, the way he'd driven her every morning for the past 5 weeks. She got into the car in silence. He pulled out into midtown traffic. Halfway to the building, she said, "I've been thinking about what comes after. After the meeting. After all of it." She was looking out the window. The company needs to change. Not just the security structure, the whole way decisions get made, who has access to challenge things, how much any one person can accumulate without oversight. She paused. I built it to be resilient to the outside. I didn't build it to be resilient to the inside. I thought if I controlled who got close, I controlled the risk. It's a reasonable assumption, Mason said. It's just not complete. No. A pause. It's what my father thought too. He trusted one person completely. I decided not to trust anyone completely. Neither of us built a system that didn't depend on individual judgment. He drove. The city moved past the windows. What are you going to do about Harmon's position? He asked. Interim replacement from outside the company, and then a restructuring of how security leadership reports, not to the executive suite, to the full board, with an independent security audit every 18 months. She paused. I should have done that from the start. You didn't know what you were building against. No, but I should have assumed I was building against something. She looked at him in the mirror. You assumed that. That's how you found the camera. That's a specific kind of paranoia I came by professionally, he said. Most people don't have it, and it's probably for the best. She almost smiled, not quite, but close. The particular near smile that he'd come to recognize as the version she let out when something struck her as genuinely funny, and she wasn't performing anything. I'm going to offer you a position, she said, after today, a real one. Director level, executive access, salary that makes your current arrangement look like a rounding error. I want you to know that before you walk into this meeting so that you're not surprised by it later. He'd been waiting for this. He'd seen it coming in the way she'd been talking about the restructuring, the way she'd included him in planning conversations that went beyond anything a driver needed to know about. I know, he said. You know? I figured you'd offer something like that. She looked at him. And? He turned onto the block where the Caldwell Industries building stood. The morning light was doing the thing it did sometimes in Manhattan, coming through at an angle between buildings that turned everything briefly gold. I'll tell you after the meeting, he said. She accepted this in the way she accepted things that couldn't be resolved immediately. Set it aside, moved on. He was starting to understand that this was one of her better qualities. She didn't waste energy on things she couldn't act on yet. Richard Vale arrived at 9:03. Mason watched him come off the elevator from a position near the reception desk. He wasn't in the meeting room. He had no standing to be in the meeting room, but he'd arranged with Helena to be in the building for the duration because there were variables he couldn't monitor from outside, and he wasn't willing to not monitor them. Vale looked exactly as he always looked, composed, silver-haired, the weight of accumulated authority in how he moved through a space. He was accompanied by 2 attorneys, one Mason recognized from the corporate governance world and one he didn't, which meant Vale had brought in outside counsel in the past week, which meant he'd known something was coming even if he didn't know the full shape of it. Vale walked past Mason without looking at him, then stopped, turned. He looked at Mason for a long moment. Mason looked back at him. Vale's face went through something complicated and then settled into a version of its usual composure that was slightly different from the real thing, the way a painting looks when you know the original has been replaced. Mr. Reed, he said. Mr. Vale, Mason said. They looked at each other. There was nothing else to say, and Vale knew it. He turned and walked into the conference room. Boss. Mason didn't hear this board meeting directly. He heard the shape of it afterward, from Avery, and pieces of it from Helena's notes, and some of it from the building's internal communications system that he'd arranged, with Avery's knowledge and Briggs's approval, to have running during the session. Vale opened with his motion for executive review. He was confident in the way of someone who believes they are managing a situation they understand. He presented the financial discrepancy model, the narrative adjustment that Harmon and Sykes had constructed, and invited the board to consider whether the current executive structure was serving the company's interests. 3 board members appeared receptive. 2 were neutral. 1 was already on Avery's side visibly. Then the witnesses entered, not simultaneously. 1 at a time, which Helena had choreographed because she understood that accumulation was more powerful than simultaneous presentation. Each one landed and settled before the next one arrived. First, the financial forensic analyst Avery had engaged through Helena's firm, who walked the board through the manufactured discrepancies and explained in language designed for financial professionals but accessible to anyone paying attention exactly how they'd been constructed and what their actual relationship to the company's real performance was. Then the independent security auditor, who had reviewed the B2 garage camera repositioning and the modified access badge and Harmon's activity logs from Tuesday night. Then the corporate records showing Briar Street Capital's acquisition of Caldwell textile assets and the ownership chain, and the timeline of Richard Vale's introduction to Avery 6 months later. Vale's lead attorney tried to object twice. Helena, who was in the room as Avery's legal counsel, addressed both objections with the calm efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this specific meeting for 10 days and had anticipated both objections before Vale's attorney had thought of them. Vale himself went very still. Mason, in the reception area, was watching the time. Briggs had 2 agents in the building. He'd confirmed their positions that morning. They were waiting for the board vote to conclude. The vote took 4 minutes, 7-1 against Vale's motion. The one was Vale himself. The room was silent for a moment after the count. Then Avery spoke, and though Mason couldn't hear the words through the walls, he heard the tone, steady, not triumphant, the voice of someone who has resolved something difficult and feels the weight of the resolution rather than the release. The door opened 20 minutes later. Vale came out first, flanked by his attorneys, and Briggs's agents stepped forward from their positions near the elevator bank. Vale stopped. He looked at the agents. He looked past them at Mason. The composure held. That was the strange thing, the composure held. He looked at Mason with an expression that was beyond anger, something colder and more complete. The expression of a man who has spent most of his adult life building towards something and is now watching it end in a corporate hallway with a former Navy SEAL who was supposed to have been a controlled variable. "You were meant to be a tool," Vale said quietly. Not to Mason specifically, more to the situation, to the shape of how it had gone wrong. "I know," Mason said. Vale looked at him for another moment. Then the agents were moving him toward the elevator, and his attorneys were talking, and the hallway became a procedural thing. Mason watched the elevator doors close. He stood there for a moment in the 34th floor hallway of Caldwell Industries, with the city visible through the windows to his right and the sound of the board meeting winding down behind him. Then Avery was in the doorway. She looked at him across the hallway. She had the particular quality of someone who has just done something very difficult and is in the moment immediately after it. Not relief exactly, more like the strange lightness of having carried something for a long time and set it down and not yet knowing what to do with your hands. "He's gone," she said. "Yes." A pause. "Helena wants to debrief in 20 minutes. I'll be here." She looked at him for a moment longer. Her jaw did the slight tightening that he recognized as her managing something she wasn't ready to put into words yet. "Thank you," she said. Not the polite version, the one that meant something specific. He nodded. She went back into the conference room, and through the closing door he caught a brief glimpse of the board members beginning to stand, beginning to gather their things, the slow exhale of a room where something significant has concluded. He turned to the window. The city spread out below in the way cities did from height, indifferent to specific events, too large to register any single story within its constant and enormous accumulation of stories. Somewhere downtown, federal processing. Somewhere in Jersey, Helena's files. Somewhere in Queens, Emma was at school doing fractions that she didn't understand the point of. He'd told Emma, last night, some of what had happened. Not all of it. The age-appropriate version, that he'd been involved in something complicated with his work, that some people had tried to use her to pressure him, that they weren't going to be able to do that anymore. She'd listened with the serious attention she brought to things she understood were important. Then she'd said, "Is your boss okay?" He'd told her yes, his boss was okay. "Good," Emma had said, and gone back to the library book. He looked out at the city and thought about what came next. The federal case, his testimony, his real name in public records for the first time in 2 years. The restructuring of Caldwell Industries. The position Avery had offered, which he was going to decline, which she already seemed to know he was going to decline. And the thing that lived under all of that, the thing he was only beginning to understand how to think about, which was that he had spent 2 years building a quiet life out of the remains of a louder one. And that quiet life had been broken open over 5 weeks, and what was on the other side of it wasn't what he'd had before and wasn't what he'd had during those 5 weeks, and was something new that he didn't have a name for yet. He was still standing at the window when Avery came back out, 20 minutes later, Helena and 2 board members behind her. She stopped beside him. The board members peeled off toward the elevator. "Ready?" she said. He looked at the city one more time. "Helena knows a place for the debrief?" he asked. "Her office, 12 blocks. "I'll drive," he said. She almost smiled again. Closer this time to actually making it. They walked toward the elevator together, and somewhere in the distance the city made its usual sounds, cabs and sirens, and 10 million people moving through their Tuesday morning. And Mason thought about how ordinary it all was, from the outside. How ordinary and how much was always happening underneath. The federal grand jury convened 3 weeks after the board meeting, and Mason testified for 4 hours on a Wednesday morning in a downtown federal building that smelled like industrial cleaning solution and old carpet, the particular smell of institutions that process too many people to bother with atmosphere. He sat in a chair and answered questions clearly and without elaboration, the way Briggs had asked him to, the way he'd learned the first time around. That juries and grand juries alike responded better to witnesses who said exactly what they knew and stopped there, who didn't reach for meaning or context or the emotional weight of things, who let the facts carry the story because the facts, in this case, were sufficient. He talked about Meridian Tactical Group, about what he'd witnessed, about the decision to testify the first time, the protected identity, the 11 days driving Avery Caldwell before he understood what he'd been placed into. He talked about the garage, about Walsh, about Emma in Philadelphia with a man who smelled like cigarettes. The assistant prosecutor was a young woman, maybe 30, who had the specific quality of someone who had worked very hard to be in this room and wasn't going to waste the opportunity. She asked good questions. She didn't lead. She let him talk. When it was over, Briggs met him in the hallway outside. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like I've been answering questions for 4 hours," he said. "You did well. You say that every time." "You do well every time," she said. "It's annoying. Most witnesses are disasters." He almost smiled. "What's the timeline on Walsh?" "He's cooperating, partially. He's giving us the operational structure in exchange for consideration on the sentencing side. His attorney is Sykes's former associate, which is ironic in a way that I find professionally satisfying." She looked at him. "He gave us 3 additional names we didn't have, people who funneled money through the Meridian Foundation into the Vail operation. It's bigger than we thought." "It's always bigger than you think." "Yes," she agreed. "It always is." She paused. "Your identity situation, the protected status, it's formally dissolved as of the filing. Your name is Mason Reed in every public and legal record as of today." He'd known this was coming. He'd prepared for it in the practical ways. Emma's school records, the apartment lease, the car registration, all of it already under his real name because he'd started transitioning it quietly in the weeks after the garage. The practical side was straightforward. The other side was harder to prepare for. The feeling of a door closing behind you permanently on a version of yourself that had been small and quiet and sometimes lonely, but had also been, in a specific way, safe. "Okay," he said. Briggs looked at him for a moment. She had known him for 4 years, which in the particular world they'd both operated in was long enough to constitute something like friendship without either of them having called it that. "You did the right thing," she said. "Both times." "I know," he said. "It cost you a lot." "I know that too." She nodded, once, and they stood in this federal building hallway for a moment in the way of 2 people who have been through something together and don't need to say so. "Buy Emma a waffle," Briggs said finally. "I already did," he said, "several times. She's developing strong opinions about waffle toppings." Briggs actually smiled at that, which was rare enough to be worth noting. He walked out of the federal building into a November morning that was cold and clear, the kind of New York day where the air felt like it had been rinsed. and he stood on the steps for a moment and looked at the street. Mason Reed, 32 years old, former Navy SEAL, former protected witness, father of one opinionated 7-year-old with strong feelings about leftover rice. That was the inventory. That was what he'd built from the pieces available to him. And it wasn't nothing. It was, in most of the ways that actually mattered, more than enough. He went to pick up Emma from school. Avery called him that evening on the burner. They'd both kept the burner phones out of habit, though the operational need for them had passed weeks ago. He found that detail quietly funny in a way he didn't examine too closely. "How was the grand jury?" she asked. "Long." "Did you eat beforehand?" He paused. "No." "Mason, there wasn't time. There's always time to eat something before 4 hours of federal testimony." She said it with the particular exasperation of someone who has been worrying about a specific thing for a while and is now permitted to say so. "I sent food to your building. Mrs. Okafor has it." He looked at his phone for a moment. "You sent food." "Helena mentioned a restaurant near the federal building that does good soup. I had it delivered." A pause. "Don't make it a thing." "I'm not making it a thing." "You're doing the quiet, where you're definitely making it a thing." "I'm not," he said. "Thank you." A pause on her end. "How are you, actually? Not the testimony. You." He thought about that. He was standing in Emma's doorway. She was asleep again, the elephant on the pillow beside her, doing the same thing he always did, the accounting. But the frequency of the accounting had changed in the past few weeks. It had gotten quieter. Not because the world was safer, exactly, but because the specific threat that had been driving it was resolved, and without that engine running, the noise settled down to something more manageable. "I'm okay," he said. "Actually, okay, not the polite version." "Good," she said. And then, "I've been thinking about what you said. When I offered you the position." He'd declined the day after the board meeting in Helena's office, while Helena was on the phone in the next room and the coffee was getting cold. He'd told her clearly and without drama. He appreciated the offer. He understood what it represented. He wasn't going to take it. She'd asked why. He told her the truth because he'd spent 15 years being someone else's asset, and he was done with that. Not with the work itself, the risk assessment, the operational thinking, the particular skill set he'd built and hadn't stopped using even when he was trying to, but with the structure of it, the belonging to. "I'm starting something," he told her now. "Independent security and risk consulting. I've got the federal contacts, the operational background, the knowledge of how financial conspiracies actually work from the inside. There's a market for that." "I know there is," she said. "I'm your first client." He'd expected this too. "Avery, not as your employer, as a contract client. Market rate, independently negotiated. You work for yourself and Caldwell Industries is one of your accounts." A pause. Helena drew up a preliminary agreement. "It's very fair. I had her err on the side of making it fair because I didn't want you to have a reason to argue about it." He stood in the hallway outside Emma's room and looked at the ceiling. "You already talked to Helena," he said. "I talked to Helena last week. Before I told you I was starting a company." "I had a strong suspicion you were going to start a company," she said. "You have the energy of a person who is allergic to working for other people. That's an unusual quality to identify in someone." "I identify unusual qualities in people. It's how I built a billion-dollar company." A pause, and something shifted in her voice, lost a layer of the dry efficiency. "Mason, let me be a client. Let it be a professional relationship on your terms. You need a first account. I need someone I trust, and I do not use that word casually, as you are aware, to overhaul my security infrastructure. It works for both of us." He thought about it, the honest accounting of it. She was right that he needed a first account, right that the Caldwell Industries restructuring was the kind of work that would establish exactly the kind of reputation he needed to build the consulting practice into something real. She was right that it worked for both of them. He was also aware that his resistance to it had less to do with the professional arrangement and more to do with the line he'd been maintaining in his own head between what was practical and what was something else, something he hadn't fully named yet and wasn't sure he was ready to. "Send me Helena's agreement," he said. She exhaled, not dramatically, just the small release of someone who'd been waiting for an answer they'd been fairly confident about, but not certain of. "I'll have her send it tonight." I'll look at it tomorrow. Thank you. Stop thanking me, he said. You're the client. I should be thanking you. You won't, though, she said. You'll read the agreement and find two things to push back on and send Helena a note about them. He looked at Emma's sleeping shape in the half-dark. Probably three things, he said. She laughed. A real one this time. The same one from the parking garage. The one that had nothing to do with happiness exactly, but everything to do with being alive on the other side of something difficult. He'd been thinking about that laugh for 3 weeks without letting himself think about it too directly. Good night, Mason, she said. Good night, he said. He pushed back on 4 things in the agreement. Helena, apparently unsurprised, adjusted 3 of them and held firm on the 4th, which was the correct call, and the contract was signed before Thanksgiving. He incorporated the company that same week. He spent a long time on the name, which Emma eventually solved by pointing at his notebook on the kitchen table and saying, "Just call it that." She meant the cover, which said "Reed" in block letters because he'd bought it from a display rack that printed names on them. Reed Consulting Group was incorporated in the state of New York on a Tuesday, which Mason found appropriate given the role Tuesdays had played in the preceding 6 weeks of his life. He told Emma, over dinner, that he was starting a new business. She received this information with the solemnity appropriate to the occasion, approximately 4 seconds of consideration, and then asked whether she could have business cards with her name on them. He told her that was not how business cards worked. She said she didn't see why not. He said he'd think about it. She took that as a yes, which was a negotiating tactic he recognized and respected, even when it was being used against him. The first time Avery came to dinner, it was unplanned. She'd come to the apartment to sign off on a physical copy of the revised security assessment Mason had prepared for the Caldwell Industries B1 and B2 parking levels. The kind of document that theoretically could have been handled electronically, but that she'd said she preferred to review in person, which he'd understood was about the document and also about something else without either of them addressing the something else directly. Emma was home because it was a Saturday. Emma had opinions about Avery from 2 sources: Mason's careful explanations of who she was, and a business profile she'd found online at school that she had printed out and brought home, which Mason had not known was possible from the school computers, but apparently was. When Avery arrived and Emma opened the door, Mason had asked her to wait for him to open it. Emma had clearly calculated that this particular instruction was negotiable. There was a brief, assessing silence on Emma's side. Then Emma said, "You're the one who sent the soup." Avery looked at Mason over Emma's head with an expression that said she had not anticipated being known for the soup specifically. "Yes," Avery said. "That was me." "It was good soup," Emma said, and stepped back to let her in with the air of someone who has rendered a verdict. Mason made dinner because there was food in the kitchen and 3 people in the apartment, and the alternative was ordering something, which worked fine, but felt wrong in a way he didn't examine. Avery sat at the kitchen table across from Emma, who proceeded to interview her with the thoroughness of a journalist who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't curious about everything. She asked about the company. She asked about the building. She'd seen pictures online. She asked whether it was hard being in charge of a lot of people. She asked whether Avery liked driving or whether she always had someone drive for her. "I used to always have someone drive me," Avery said carefully, with a sideways glance at Mason at the stove. "That's because of my dad," Emma said, with the particular confidence of a child who has connected 2 pieces of information and is proud of the connection. "He drove you." "He did." "He's good at driving," Emma said. "He's also good at other stuff, but mostly he says he's just a driver." A pause. "He wasn't just a driver, though, was he?" Avery looked at her for a moment. She had the expression Mason had come to recognize as the one she used when something had surprised her. A brief, unguarded quality, like a window opened quickly and then managed. "No," Avery said. "He wasn't." Emma nodded, satisfied, and went back to the school project she'd been working on at the table, which involved a large piece of poster board and information about the water cycle that she had been arranging and rearranging for 20 minutes with the dissatisfied energy of someone who knows what they want it to look like and can't quite get there. "You have a cloud in the wrong place," Avery said. Emma looked up. "The evaporation happens first, so the cloud formation should be in the middle of the cycle, not at the top." Avery pointed at the poster board. "If you move it here, the arrows make more sense." Emma looked at the poster board. looked at Avery, looked at the poster board again. Huh, she said. She moved the cloud. Better? Avery asked. Yeah, Emma admitted. How do you know about the water cycle? I know about a lot of things, Avery said. I spent most of my 20s learning things because I thought the more I knew, the more protected I'd be. Did it work? A pause. Some of it, she said. The parts that involved other people less. The parts that required trusting someone. Those didn't work so well when I was doing it alone. Emma absorbed this with the gravity of a 7-year-old receiving information she suspects is about more than the water cycle. Mason put food on the table. They ate dinner, the three of them, in Mason's kitchen with Emma's poster board taking up a third of the table, and the city doing its usual evening sounds outside the window, and nobody performing anything for anybody else. It was, Mason thought, the most ordinary hour he'd had in several years. He was aware that ordinary was not the same as easy. Avery was still Avery, still the woman who defaulted to solving problems alone, who held things in the controlled, careful way she'd learned when the cost of letting them out was too high, who was in the very early stages of unlearning a set of habits that had kept her functional but at a significant personal cost. She was not going to become a different person. She was going to become a more complete version of the person she already was, slowly, with setbacks, in the imperfect way that actual human change happened. And Mason was still Mason, still the man who noticed exits and tracked vehicles in mirrors, and did the constant low-level accounting that never fully stopped, who had a daughter to raise and a company to build, and a testimony to complete and a past that was now public record and would require, at some point, more conversations with Emma than the age-appropriate version he'd given so far. He was not a simple person. She was not a simple person. What was between them was not simple either, and it would not become simple, and that was fine. The things worth having rarely were. In the 12 months that followed, Mason built Reed Consulting Group from a one-person operation working out of his apartment into a firm of 4, with Caldwell Industries as the anchor client, and 3 additional accounts that came through referrals, 2 from Briggs's professional network, and 1 from Garrett, who had driven up from Baltimore for a Tuesday night and apparently knew more people in the New York financial security world than Mason had realized. He worked hard. He made mistakes, a client assessment in the spring that he'd been too confident about, an internal hire in the summer who turned out to be wrong for the work in ways that took longer to see than they should have. He fixed the mistakes and kept going, which was the only available approach to mistakes. Emma turned 8 in March. She had graduated from the water cycle project to a science fair entry about bioluminescent organisms in the deep ocean, which she had developed with the specific obsessive focus of a child who has found a topic that genuinely interests her. The library book about deep-sea fish had been joined by 3 more, and the stuffed elephant had been retired to a shelf position of honor to make room for a small plastic anglerfish that she carried instead, which she had named Gerald. Mason took her to the New York Aquarium in April. She stood in front of the jellyfish exhibit for 23 minutes without speaking, which was, for Emma, the equivalent of religious silence. Avery came to her birthday dinner. She brought a book about oceanography that was technically too advanced for an 8-year-old, which Emma received with exactly the expression she reserved for things she intended to figure out, regardless of whether they were meant for her. She and Emma had reached an accommodation in the way that children and adults sometimes did when both parties were fundamentally pragmatic. Emma respected that Avery knew things and would share them without condescension, and Avery respected that Emma had opinions that deserved to be engaged with rather than managed. Within that framework, they got along well, with occasional friction that both of them handled by being direct about it, which Mason found he preferred enormously to the alternative. What was growing between Mason and Avery grew the way things grew in real life, unevenly, with gaps and misunderstandings, and conversations that didn't resolve cleanly, and moments that did. There was one evening in June when it became something explicitly named, which happened in his car of all places, both of them sitting in the parked car outside her building at the end of an evening that had gone longer than either of them had planned, and she'd said something and he'd said something back, and they'd both sat with that for a moment. And then she'd looked at him. And the thing that had been careful and managed for a year was neither of those things anymore. It was not a clean moment. She cried a little, which she would have been furious about in any other context, and he said something that he immediately felt was inadequate, which it probably was. and they sat in his parked car for a while, not saying very much. Which was fine. Some things didn't require words. He'd been someone who protected for a long time. It was his skill and his instinct, and the thing he was built for. But protection, he'd learned, was only part of the architecture. The other part was presence. Staying. Not the tactical version of staying, not the operational commitment to see a threat through, but the ordinary, daily, sometimes boring, sometimes difficult choice to be in someone's life, and let them be in yours and see what that built over time. He'd been afraid of that. He could admit it now, at least to himself. The years of the protected identity had given him a very good excuse for keeping the walls up, and he'd used it longer than he'd needed to. Not because of the danger, because of what happened if you let someone see the full inventory and they decided it was too complicated. Avery had seen the full inventory. She'd been there for most of the complications. She'd decided anyway. That was in the way of things that didn't get simpler with examination, everything. The shareholders' meeting was in November, 1 year after the board vote that had ended Richard Vale's access to Caldwell Industries. Avery stood at the podium in the company's main presentation space. It held 300 people when full, and it was full, and gave the annual address. Mason sat in the back row, where he always sat in rooms like this, and watched. She talked about the company's performance, which had been strong. She talked about the structural changes, the new security oversight model, the independent audit process, the leadership challenge protocols she'd implemented that allowed employees at any level to raise concerns through a channel that went directly to the board rather than through the executive chain. She talked about what the previous year had cost, not in financial terms, but in the terms of the assumptions she'd been wrong about, the systems she hadn't built, the places where her belief that she could manage everything alone had created the conditions for the attack she hadn't seen coming. She said it plainly, without the corporate language that turned accountability into a performance of accountability, the way politicians apologized without ever quite getting to the apology. She was not performing remorse. She was describing what she'd learned, in the specific voice of someone who had paid for the lesson and was not going to pretend otherwise. And then, near the end, she said something that Mason hadn't known was coming. "A year ago," she said, "I was standing in a parking garage at midnight, and I understood for the first time in my professional life what it felt like to not be alone in a fight." She paused. "I had spent years believing that the safest structure was one where I controlled all the variables, where trust was a liability I could minimize by keeping people at a distance. I thought that was strength. I thought my father had been destroyed because he'd trusted too completely, and I would protect myself by not trusting at all." Another pause. "What I didn't understand, what took a quiet man who drove my car and noticed things I'd stopped looking for to show me, was that the absence of trust isn't strength. It's a different kind of exposure. You can't build something that lasts out of control alone. You need people who will tell you when you're wrong, even when it costs them something to do it." She looked out at the room. "The man I once dismissed as just my driver saved this company," she said. "He also, I think, saved me from becoming someone I wouldn't have liked very much. And I wanted to say that in front of 300 people, because I spent a long time not saying things that deserved to be said, and I'm trying to do that less." The room was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. In the back row, Mason looked at his hands. He was not a person who enjoyed being talked about in rooms, even positively, even truthfully. He had the specific discomfort of someone who had spent their life operating in the margins of other people's stories and found the center of the frame disorienting. The woman beside him, a junior analyst who had been at the company for 6 months and had no idea who Mason was, leaned over and whispered, "Do you know who she's talking about?" He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "A little." She nodded and went back to watching Avery, and Mason watched too, from the back of the room where the light was lower and the view was longer and you could see the whole shape of the thing rather than just the part directly in front of you. Avery at the podium, finishing the address. 300 people who worked for something she'd built from a rented desk in Soho. The restructured company, imperfect, still figuring itself out, with new problems that would replace the old ones because that was what organizations did. Not fixed, better. He thought about his father's old saying, something Daniel Caldwell had apparently told Avery once, which she'd told Mason on a walk in Central Park in August, when they'd been talking about nothing in particular, that the point of building something wasn't to make it perfect, but to make it honest. something that could be looked at straight and said to be what it claimed. Mason didn't know if he was what he claimed. He wasn't always sure what he claimed. He was a person with a complicated history and a 7-year-old who had named her plastic fish Gerald, and a consulting firm with 4 employees and a contract with the most demanding client he'd ever had, who also sometimes sent soup. It was a person who had testified twice against people he knew, when staying quiet would have been easier, who had stood in a parking garage with 4 men and a decision and held to the line he'd drawn for himself even when the situation would have justified crossing it, who had driven a car for 11 days and noticed things that mattered and said something about them when the easier path was silence. He was not, in any version of any story, a perfect person. He lost his temper occasionally with Emma's homework resistance. He was sometimes too quiet in situations that called for words. He worried more than was useful and trusted his instincts over other people's information more than was always warranted. But he showed up. That was the part he'd come to understand was the actual work, not the skill or the training or the operational thinking, valuable as those were. The actual work was showing up, in the ordinary daily sense, for the people and the things that deserved it, consistently. Even when it was inconvenient, even when it cost something, especially then. The address ended. The room did its thing. Applause, the shifting of a crowd beginning to move, people reaching for phones and drinks and each other. Avery stepped down from the podium and immediately had 3 people angling toward her with questions. She found Mason's eye across the room. She gave him the look that was not quite a smile, the one that had been not quite a smile for a year and had recently started landing closer to the real thing more often than not. He nodded once. She turned back to the 3 people with questions, and he watched her field them with the competence and directness she brought to everything, and he thought about Emma at school right now, probably arguing with someone about something, definitely right. He stood up and headed for the door. He had a 3:30 pickup and a 4 o'clock meeting with a potential new client that Garrett had referred, and Emma got out at 3:15, and he was, in all the ways that actually mattered, exactly where he was supposed to be. The city was doing what it always did outside, indifferent, enormous, full of stories happening simultaneously in all directions with no particular regard for which ones deserved attention. Mason Reed walked out into it. Not invisibly this time, just quietly, which was different. Quiet was a choice. Invisible had been a necessity. He was done with necessities. He had a daughter to pick up and a company to run, and a life that was, in its messy and specific and entirely real way, his own. That was enough.